Good morning, everyone. So sorry, I'm late, an hour and a half ahead from home. Does not guarantee I'll be here on time. So we depend on I-15. We just depend on being able to get through. So I apologize for starting the meeting late. And so welcome. And if you'll join me, let's stand in and give a pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you so much. I believe we have at least one individual who'd like to make comment this morning. Others, Joanne, thank you so much. No problem. All right. So we have a couple, and we're going to go ahead with both of those individuals, and we're happy to have you here. We remind you that as we have public comment, just a reminder for those of you who may not have been here before, we don't respond to those comments in this meeting. We're not going to discuss them, but we would like them, and we are listening carefully, and it doesn't mean that we won't follow up as we continue. But today we can talk about issues, and in those comments we're very careful about, we don't speak about individuals. If there's someone that needs to speak about an individual, we'd be glad to talk to you separately about that outside. So let's begin. Jonathan, I suspect you're Jonathan because you were stepped right up into place, and thank you for doing it. And go ahead.
Yes, my name is Jonathan Bejarano. I am not affiliated with any group, or I'm just here for me. And I get public meeting notices and I read them. And I was just very concerned over a request that was going to be made. And so I went to APA's board meeting to try to get context about this request. And I'm still very concerned. And so, as I understand it, a charter school needs to get your permission, Chair Bowles, to be able to forward that on to the state board. And in my understanding, it needs to have data accompanied with that request. And I didn't see any data that shows or support the request. And I would ask that you not consider anything to do with statute about, we can exempt someone from this rule because the statute says otherwise. That's not this body's place, and it's not ripe, and I would ask that it not be discussed. Instead, the data should be discussed. The school climate survey has already been distributed to many LEAs, and the results are on USBE's website, and I've perused them, and they're very concerning to me, especially administrators' responses. If I go down and I select white or Caucasian administrators, they tend to believe that the curriculum and the materials and the books represent their community fairly well. But once we narrow that down and we take the BIPOC population, there's like 230 of them that responded to the survey and that chose to put in their race, that number drops by like 23 points. And so what I'm concerned about is a charter school that has their own idea and they want to do that. That's great. But there are people that they serve that are going to potentially be harmed by not considering them and not being seen. And so I would ask you that you consider that. Invisibility of race and ethnicity is damaging. Professor Eduardo Bonilla Silva's claimed that colorblind racism can actually be more harmful than previous traditional blatant racism because people who believe they are colorblind are oblivious to their racism. So I think it's very important that we consider not the law, but we look at the data. And as a public charter school, we need to be held accountable and we need to be transparent. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you so much. We appreciate that you are exercising exactly what citizens in this nation should do, to speak up when you have a concern. And this is a government of, by and for the people. So thank you
Thank
for
you.
participating.
Point of order.
Pardon me?
What time, how many minutes are we
Do you know what?
allowing?
And I didn't set a time today. I think that we just have 2. So public comments, Debbie Llewellyn, also from UAPCS. Yes, Debbie? The sign-in sheet. Well, Debbie, welcome. We're glad to have you here. You're signed in. So that's good. So I think as far as I know, we have no other public comments today. Thank you for asking that question. I should have established that at the first. Thank you so much. I'm going to go past right now the mission, vision, values review. We're going to do that at the end today as we talk about our strategic plan. Thank you for including it, Director Lambert, because it is something that I've asked to have on there, but I'm going to just hold it today until that end of the meeting discussion. We have kind of an interesting meeting today. We're conducting some business at the first of the meeting, and then we're going to go to another room where we can sit a little closer around the table and just have a workshop and learn from our team and have some discussion in just a little bit more informal way, not taking votes, but just discussing and learning. So we are at a place, though, we'd love to have a thought from Vice Chair Phillips, please. Thank you.
As many of you know, I have a healthy distrust of authority, and so perhaps my topic today will not come as a surprise. In 494 BCE, after defeating a joint attack by the Sabines, the Volsci, and the Aequi, a victorious Roman army returned home. The general celebrated a triumph and was allocated a curule seat in the Circus Maximus for himself and his descendants in perpetuity. Many of the common soldiers, plebeians, returned to ruined farms, a heavy tax levy, debts, usury, and the prospect of torture, prison, and debt slavery. In his History of Rome, Ab Urbe Condita, Livy describes what happened among the poorest of returning soldiers, many of whom were in chains awaiting the fate determined by their creditors and the senators who refused to listen or amend their decisions. This passage is from Book 2 of that history and is a translation by Benjamin Oliver Foster. These men complained loudly that while they were abroad fighting for liberty and dominion, they had been enslaved and oppressed at home by fellow citizens, and that the freedom of the plebeians was more secure in war than in peace, amongst enemies than amongst citizens. This bitter feeling, which was growing spontaneously, the notable calamity of one man, fanned into a flame. Old and bearing the marks of all his misfortunes, the man rushed into the forum. His dress was covered with filth, and the condition of his body was even worse, for he was pale and half dead with emaciation. Besides this, his straggling beard and hair had given a savage look to his countenance. He was recognized nevertheless, despite the hideousness of his appearance, and the word went round that he had commanded companies, even achieved other military honors. And the man himself displayed the scars on his own breast, which bore testimony to his honorable service in various battles. When they asked the reason for his condition and his squalor, he replied, while the crowd gathered about him much as though it were an assembly, that during his service in the Sabine War, not only had the enemy's depredations deprived him of his crops, but his cottage had been burnt, all his belongings plundered, and his flocks driven off. Then the taxes had been levied in an untoward moment for him, and he had contracted debts. When these had been swelled by usury, they had first stripped him of his farm, which had been his father's and his grandfather's before him, then of the remnants of his property, and finally, like an infection, they had attacked his person, and he had been carried off by his creditor, not to slavery in his case, but to the prison and torture chamber. He then showed them his back, disfigured with the wails of his recent scourging. The sight of these things in the man's recital produced a mighty uproar. The disturbance was no longer confined to the forum, but spread in all directions through the entire city. Those who had been bound over, whether in chains or not, broke out into the streets from every side and implored the Quirites to protect them. End of quote. The Quirites, it should be noted, are the common people of Rome acting in a civil rather than in a military or political capacity. This powerful demonstration of injustice inspired the plebeians to stage an unprecedented protest. They removed themselves from Rome and gathered at the Mons Sacer, which had the effect of closing down all work in shops, industries, and farms, and left the city vulnerable to attack by its enemies. Realizing their vulnerability, and after much negotiation, Roman senators made a major concession to the plebeians. A new plebeian office would be created, that of the tribune of the people, who would be elected by the people in their own assembly, the Concilium Plebis, and who would be granted a unique authority of office. This tribune would have the power to intervene on behalf of the plebeians by stating veto or I forbid whenever he deemed that the actions of consuls, the Comitia Centuriata, an assembly weighted by wealth, or the Senate unjustly harmful to the common people. The tribune was given inviolability by the agreement, or security from violation or profanation, as this officer would naturally be the target, saying no to all the most powerful people in Rome. He would naturally be the target of the anger and frustration of these powerful men of state. This instance is not the only record we have of protest from the ancient world, but the secession of the plebs, as it is called, is noteworthy in several ways. It happened another 4 times over a 200-year period in Rome, affecting an increase each time in the plebeian share of power in the state, until finally the conflict of orders was fully resolved. Each protest was generally a bloodless protest, with the effect of forcing both sides to reconsider their views and come to a compromise that both sides could live with, and each time the society that emerged was more just. Dissent is the strong disagreement or dissatisfaction with a decision, circumstance, or opinion that is supported either by those in authority or by a majority that effectively rules. We do not always embrace dissent because it's troubling, uncomfortable, even feels at times unpatriotic. Dissent often crosses lines of decorum or what we have come to believe is appropriate or sanctioned. In his speech given at Riverside Church in 1967 against the Vietnam War and its effect on the Vietnamese people, Martin Luther King Jr. stated, "There are those seeking to equate dissent with disloyalty. It's a dark day in our nation when high-level authority will seek to use every method to silence dissent," he said. "Something is happening and people are not going to be silent," end of quote. If we are honest, we must admit that dissent may be the most American and patriotic of actions. After all, the United States of America was founded on dissent, grievances against England, and King George's disregard for these grievances. The right to petition the government, whether by filing lawsuits, writing letters, collecting signatures for ballot initiatives and referenda, or simply to express grievances in order to provoke government action, is among the most precious liberties safeguarded by the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is, in many ways, our tribune of the people, a prohibition or veto against actions that may harm the common people or a minority of people. In his article found in the Informed Citizen, November 10th, 2020, Cedric M. Powell, a professor at Louis Brandeis School of Law, explains the importance of dissent as allowed by the First Amendment. Protest highlights flaws in our democracy. It uncovers structural inequality, and it offers ideas for progressive social change. It tells our leaders that they should consider different policy choices so that all citizens are included. Besides encouraging different perspectives, dissent may be the most selfless and patriotic of conscience, acts of conscience. As Charles Meikling Jr. explained nearly 60 years ago in his article, The Right to Dissent in a Free Society from the American Bar Association Journal, in no other country of the world is the right of dissent so deeply enshrined as it is in the United States. The reasons for this attitude lie deep in our cultural roots. In the American ethos, dissent is much more than disaffection or opposition based on an aversion or self-interest. It implies a position taken on principle, an act of conscience. To many Americans, the term carries quasi-religious connotations that extenuate and occasionally justify even its most extreme and unattractive manifestations, end of quote. He goes on to remind us that dissent is embedded in the clauses of the Declaration of Independence, a document that establishes government's authority on its work toward achieving equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that people have the right to alter or abolish governments that don't work to achieve these goals, and that all government policies and courses of action are better because of free discussion and the opportunity to dissent. We are better as a society because we are able to dissent. In her book, In Defense of Troublemakers, The Power of Dissent in Life and Business, Charlene Nemeth, a researcher at UC Berkeley, writes, "When we are exposed to dissent, our thinking does not narrow as it does when we are exposed to consensus. In fact, dissent broadens our thinking. Relative to what we would do on our own if we had not been exposed to dissent, we think in more open ways and in multiple directions. We consider more information and more options, and we use multiple strategies in problem solving. We think more divergently, more creatively," end of quote. She also argues, interestingly, that consensus opinions, even when they are verifiably wrong, exercise an undue and stifling influence on our thinking that leads to stagnation and the opposite of a growth mindset. How I love, personally, the dissenters, and you rely on them too, whether you acknowledge it or not. Martin Luther, Mahatma Gandhi, Jesus Christ, Martin Luther King Jr., Galileo Galilei, Malala Yousafzai, Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Ida B. Wells, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, the amazing list of dissenting opinions that we have from the Supreme Court justices who have dissented on the US Supreme Court. And the list goes on and on. Perhaps, as Mark Twain advised, when you find yourself on the side of the majority or under the persuasion of those with too much authority and consensus, it's time to reform.
Wow, beautifully written. Thank you so much, Vice Chair Phillips.
Thank you.
I was going to say that there's a kind of piece of writing that should be read in the congressional record. Although I've read pieces from the congressional record, not as well written as that. So thank you. It was beautifully written and a great reminder to us to discuss civilly, and that's an important part of our process, and to listen to dissenting voices. And I love that list of dissenters that you included in that as well. Judo, if we'd each written a thought and put them out on the table and no names, would you have been able to identify that as Vice Chair Phillips writing? Absolutely. I would say I knew exactly from whom that great writing came, and the references to Rome and others. So thank you so much for sharing with us, and good thought for us to ponder as well. Thank you. All right. Now we go from that to actually a celebration, and not in dissent, but in celebration and cheering for some, just as a reminder that our June board meeting, just as you're starting to think ahead, here we're supposed to be in spring, but I walked in with an umbrella in snow this morning, but tomorrow or the next day it'll be hot again. So, and my daffodils are not happy with the cold again, but here we go. But in a couple of months, it won't be long that we will be able to again celebrate some of our schools who have achieved great success. We had a wonderful time celebrating them in the same way we've chosen to celebrate again this year. But those schools are identified, showcased for excellence based on our accountability framework, academic enrollment and financial metrics, and based on those, individual schools have been identified. And I think, we'll just unveil them on that day, or are we going to, you'll say I know you know already who the schools are, but maybe, I don't know if we're going to announce when we get closer to the time, or.
It depends upon what you want. Last year we did it at that day.
Let's do it at that
They know
day.
who they are.
Yeah, let's do that that day. I know that they know, and so, but it's kind of fun to unveil that and to make it a celebration. And I could just tell you that we're going to celebrate at the Smith Ballpark, but I want to, I'm guessing Director Lambert wrote this, or someone from our team wrote this, and it's too well written for me not to just paraphrase. So I've got to say, they said, this year the celebration will include dinner and entertainment at the Smith's Ballpark, where we will enjoy, in parentheses, definitely, great company, maybe summer weather, and hopefully, in parentheses again, a bee's victory. So those three things together on that day, and we did have a great time celebrating last year and eating hot dogs together and cheering and being able to meet with those schools and take time to say hello. And so we'll do that again in June. On June 8th, our meeting will start later on that day so that we can then move to the ballpark and coincide with the starting of the game at 6:30. So that you'll know that. So prepare and think about June, ready to celebrate. Yeah, go ahead.
Just
Dr.
one other comment. So because what we're celebrating is going to be the dinner, there are discounted tickets. So like if you have family that would like to join, we can help facilitate that. There's discounted tickets for the dinner and
Thank you
everything.
so
yeah.
much. Yeah, oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I think probably several of us would be happy to contact you and talk about that and to be able to. Director Lambert, go ahead.
Just along with that, we, even though we only choose of those that we are doing the comprehensive review that year. So it's not every well-performing school we rotate around so we can see more schools and interact with them more individually. But we have invited all of charters and to send out to their communities as
Oh, great.
well for those discounted tickets. So we're hoping
Fabulous.
to have a good turnout.
It's a charter school day at the ballpark.
Yes.
Which is a good thing. We love that. The charter day at the ballpark. That's great. I love that. All right. Because I was rushing in and thinking I got to get going. I'm already late. I failed to take a minute to recognize also that from this Utah State Board of Education, our liaison member, Carrie, we appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. We represent Angie Stallings, Deputy Superintendent in the State Board of Education. We thank you for attending our meeting as well. And from the Attorney General's office, our representative, AG Olson, thank you for being at the table with us, as well as our staff members, as well as the board. Thank you. And I should recognize that member Spiker, who would normally be with us, who also teaches at Weber State University, has a Weber State commitment today that she couldn't, she had to attend. She felt really torn and would have liked to have been with us. So I wanted to take time to recognize that. Then let's go to Director Lambert's report. Thank you.
Had a little brain freeze for a moment and forgot to turn on my mic. So thank you. I just want to give some exciting news for my director's report. And the first thing that I want to share with you is, as you remember, one of your board goals was for to develop a micro-credential training system for governing boards. And the deadline, or the first timeline on that, was by the end of this year, this school year, to have it implemented with, and I forget how many was the minimum, like 10 trainings. We blew that out of the water, as you'll see in a minute. So that's why we haven't been focusing on that too much. But I want to give you just a little taste of what we will soon be launching. And we're really excited about this. So first, that looks really small, but just you kind of get a feel of what this will be, the landing page. And you will notice in the background, that's one of our student art. So whenever we can, we highlight the art, which, by the way, we are doing again. So we'll get to change that up from year to year. But this was one of our artists. And if I remember right, this was like kindergartner, but second grader, someone really young and did better than I did. But also, while you may not be able to see that on the screen, at least the one that I'm looking at, it's really microscopic, but we have resurrected a term that has been used for a number of years, and we're rebranding it and improving on it. And it's called GBOT. It stands for Governing Board Online Training. Since we've used that in the past, some of the board members, some of the schools will already recognize that. We figured that we would use it again and just build on it. But you will see some little fun differences, and you'll see a little fun robot throughout that we really, because we recognize that our governing boards, they're volunteers. They don't have a lot of time. So we're really trying to make this very accessible. And there's games that are part of it, and just to make it fun so that hopefully it will draw individuals in. The second thing, this is the dashboard that or the top of the dashboard. And so again, you see those little fun robots. You see our color screen or our color scheme on this screen. You will see our logo, and just to welcome them on. From the dashboard, you would be able to, and you can see in that upper right-hand corner, maybe you can see it, you can enter a text to search. Right now, I said that the goal was to have at least 10 trainings in there. We will start with over 50,000 trainings. So we were able to connect in with an LMS management company that already has a lot of trainings that we can utilize. We're also building very specific trainings just for our governing boards in addition to that. So we have a great variety of training that we're able to offer our governing boards to use. And there's a lot of different topics that they'll be able to use. So it can be something for fun, or it can be something necessary. So for example, OPMA, Open and Public Meetings training, has to be done every year. And that is a training that can be in here. And speaking of which, so this screenshot is what it might look like for an individual when they actually come into it. And you will see that you have like their plan summary. It shows what they have done. You will see maybe ones that are coming up. There is a really great feature that we're able to build in that if the boards want to say, use this to take care of their OPMA training that's required of every year, they could do this. And then there's reminders that come to them every year. So they don't have to remember, oh, I've got to get this done before the end of the year. So there can be some reminders sent out as well. And then you see the leaderboard. We're trying to make this fun and even maybe put in people like competition. They like games, right? So we've just been testing it out. You can see Lisa is doing a really great job. She's the leader right now, but then they can kind of play and have that. We really are just trying to make this accessible and fun and easy for our board members so that if they choose to use this, which we really hope that they will and they'll find value in it, that it can help bolster the capacity for our governing boards in the schools that we authorize and just allow them to be able to get that training. Any questions?
I just want to say, first of all, this is so great. I'm so
Yeah,
excited about
absolutely.
this. Have we considered whether it might be possible for us to grant CEUs to educators who complete these trainings and or partner with universities perhaps to provide some form of credit?
So that is a wonderful idea. We have talked with some of the higher education folks. We, of course, cannot grant credit, but that is something that would be a long-term type thing. It will not come out in June or July, for that. But that is something that we have discussed with different agencies or universities.
Right on. Go ahead, Mrs. Narrows.
Question, where is it going to be housed? UCAP separate? Like where would boards find it?
Help me know, where is this going to be? And I just want to say, I want to thank Marie, Lisa, Amber, and then Saba, who's been really doing the heavy lifting on all of this, getting it together. So I'm going to phone a friend. Marie, can you help me know where this is going to be housed?
Yes, it's its own learning management site, but we can link to it from UCAP and from our own website as well. So we'll have access points both in UCAP and from our state charter school board website.
And I can just say in general, that's what we're trying to do, is make it kind of a one-stop that while like we know what UCAP is, we're trying to make it, at least for the public, when they're accessing UCAP, they don't necessarily have to know that they're just going to our website and clicking links to get on there. So hopefully for the user, there won't be a lot of difference in what they're seeing.
Any other comments, questions with that? I thank you so much. I have to tell you how much I appreciate you doing. You could have just done plain text and just had something available, but 50,000 opportunities plus robots, plus a game, plus student artwork. it just elevates it beyond okay to something really exceptional that others should try to emulate. It really is beautifully done. And it makes me also think this is a time I also for months we've had fabulous newsletters. I hope every time you receive a copy of those that you're looking through them. This last one featured Member Smith's fabulous shoes, her creativity, and we get to know her better. We get to know individuals from the schools better, and lots of news items. But they're beautifully put together, written, and fun to read. I'm compelled. When I start, I hate to stop, and that's a good sign because I want to finish and read through the whole thing. So that's always, the best test that I'm drawn in and continue, and that's true of every month. So it's a good time. We haven't said that, I think, in this meeting to say thank you for that. And we're just scratching the surface of a lot of good things that are happening. So thank you so much.
I'm not done either. Good things.
Oh, sorry, I jumped right in. So
No.
do
I
you
just
want?
have a comment on this.
Okay, so Vice Chair Phillips and then back to Director Lambert.
I just want to say, one of the things I think is so helpful about this tool essentially and content that you've put together or linked into is the ability for our governing boards to target their needs. So some of the best, sort of pedagogical or sound pedagogical methods here, because most of them aren't going to need 50,000 micro credentials, but they are going to desperately need maybe a very targeted 10 that we won't necessarily be able to identify, but they can do their own board evaluation. Sometimes we'll help them identify them, no doubt. But I just love the fact that this is going to be very efficient and strengthen our governing boards, which is one of the best ways we all know of strengthening our charter schools. So
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Well, and I just want to echo that because this has been exciting for us. There was at times a little bit of roller coasters on, oh, is this going to be what we think it is? And I just want to thank the staff that's been doing the heavy lifting on this and just being able to make this so usable. And I think even more than what we envisioned on the outset of it. So we're excited for it. And I'm sorry I'm taking some time, but there's just a lot of amazing things going on. I just want to, you may have seen this, but charter schools, USBE, Superintendent Dixon was able to at CCSSO highlight some of the great things that charter schools have been able to do in using the ESSER funds in moving forward with digital teaching and learning in charter schools. And Brooke Austin, who is the assistant principal or director, she's at Odyssey. She was there presenting along with Superintendent Dixon. So we just want to thank her for the great representation and also thank USBE for being able to allocate those funds and to focus on that. It's been definitely useful. I then want to highlight Laura Gibbons. She is from Mountain Heights Academy. She received the Utah Governor's Medal for Science and Technology for K-12 education. She was the only K-12 educator that was highlighted in this. She is a science teacher, and we just want to send our thanks for all the great work that she is doing and honor her.
Absolutely.
Then you may have also seen the news story on this, but there were 3 graduates from Utah Military Academy, or soon to be graduates, who were accepted at the top military schools in our nation. So Matthew Marchant, he was accepted into the Naval Academy. Joshua Kraus was accepted into the Merchant Marine Academy, and Gavin Vollmer was accepted into the Military Academy at West Point. And so we want to also congratulate them for being able to do that. And then, this is a long list, but there were a number of charter schools who they achieved above 80% growth on Acadience reading. So I'm just going to list quickly, in the parentheses was which grade they achieved that for. And there was one that achieved it for all 3 grades, and that's Mountainville Academy. So definitely want to highlight them. But that was Dual Immersion Academy, John Hancock Charter School, Legacy Preparatory Academy, Lincoln Academy, Mana Academy Charter School, Moab Charter School, Mountainville Academy, North Star Academy, Odyssey Charter School, Ranches Academy, Thomas Edison, and Wasatch Peak Academy. So just want to thank them for all of the great growth that they were able to achieve with their students. And that ends my director's report.
Wow, that was, you can give that kind of report anytime you want. That is a fabulous report. Thank you so much. Wow, good things happening in schools, everyone. Really good things. Our students are lucky. We are lucky to be a part of it. Thank you, Director Lambert, for a great report. Thank you so much. Let's move to our consent calendar. Is there anything on the consent calendar anyone would like to pull from consent? If not, I would be happy to accept a motion. Member Smith.
To adopt the consent calendar?
Okay, a motion to accept the consent. A second to that motion?
I'll second that.
And a second from Member Bassett. Any discussion on consent? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Nay, no? All right, that passes unanimously. Our consent, let's move to our waiver request is the next item on our agenda. And Ms. Stephenson is going to talk about that. Oh, yes, Member Olson.
Yeah, before we proceed with that, I just wanted to mention that I'll be abstaining from the discussion and vote of this agenda item.
Thank you so much.
Good morning, board members. This waiver request comes to you on the agenda today due to the fact that waivers are required to have an authoriser's recommendation before they can move to the Utah State Board of Education. And so American Preparatory Academy is seeking a waiver, and that waiver is for the climate survey, the school climate survey. And in that waiver, they are seeking to either be able to not administer the school climate survey or to have certain questions removed from that survey. As we reviewed their request and we saw that the school climate survey is not something that is included in their charter specifically, and that data that is received is not something that is typically reviewed by the state charter school board, nor is it something that as a state charter school board that we typically receive, but that it goes directly to the LEA for them to be able to disperse to their community, rather than an approval of a yes or a no. We thought that it may be worth considering simply providing a recommendation that the USBE hear the request and make the decision as it is their survey, and that then they can work with their council and decide what they would like to do with that request. Staff can answer any other questions that you have, as well as American Preparatory Academy that is here. If you would like to invite them to the table, I will turn that back to you, Chair Bowles.
Thank you. Thank you for that report, Ms. Stevenson. And American Preparatory Academy, you're welcome to come to the table. We didn't ask you to present and prepare anything, but you may have some things you'd like to say, and we would be happy to listen to that discussion. So please come join us at the table. Be sure to turn on your mics as you speak. And I know if I don't say anything, Ms. Castillo is going to say to me, they need to introduce themselves so she can put it in the minutes correctly and get your right name. So if you'll each introduce yourselves, at least as you speak, so that she can record your names correctly. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Shred, Executive Director of American Preparatory Schools, and I will just introduce our guests here today. We have our Director of Compliance. These are members of our executive team, so Lisa Brunson, and our CFO, Casey Krellin. We also have our counsel, Dave Mortensen, and we don't have a lot to say today, but we are grateful for a chance to just say thank you to you for all of your amazing volunteer service as our authorizer and staff. for all you do. And we did bring a couple resources if you think they would be helpful to you in the future if someone were to ask you any questions about this. When we first administered this survey in 2019 on a pilot, 2021, and then 2023. So this is kind of an interesting chain of events. There was statute in place that said that the state would create a model survey that may be used. So here's your statute, and it's highlighted in May. When the rule came out from USBE, they made it into a shall, that the LEAs shall use the model climate survey that they created. And then a new law was passed, the safety law in 2022, privacy and about from the safety committee legislature. And they kind of talk about surveys in general, which we think might impact this survey. And I don't think it's ever been looked at from a legal viewpoint, those two statutes together now. So we just had a question about it. We've always surveyed our parents every year. And so we have a survey already that we do administer. These are our parent questions right here. These are the staff questions. And actually the orange ones on here are the same as in the model climate survey. So we wanted to have you to have this information so you can see we're not asking to not survey. We have our own survey. We think the law allows us to have our own. And so we're asking the state board to kind of just do a review. And I'm going to just pass these folders around. If you want to just shred them, you're welcome to. If you want, if they're useful to you, great. And then I'll let Mr. Mortensen speak while I pass those out.
David Mortensen, counsel for American Preparatory Academy, and I'll be very brief because Ms. Charette's already sort of discussed the issue. But the issue is that there's a bit of a conflict between the statute that was passed by the legislature and the rule that was passed by the State Board of Education in its rulemaking authority. The statute, section 53G 8-802, which Ms. Charette will be passing out to you, it's on a pink sheet of paper there. It authorizes the State Board of Education to create a model survey, climate survey, that may, is the language, be used by an LEA. It then goes on to say that they instructs the USBE to use its rulemaking authority to adopt rules, and it says this, requiring an LEA to create or adopt and disseminate a school climate survey. So APA is not suggesting it's not, it does intend to and has submitted a school climate survey. It just, the law, as created by the legislature, says that it could either create its own or adopt a survey that is created by the State Board of Education. Unfortunately, in creating the State Board of in the State Board of Education, when it created its rule, the rule it created says an LEA shall administer a school climate survey containing the questions identified in the model school climate survey. And so it changed it from a may adopt and use the model to a shall adopt and use the model. And ultimately the school is looking for an opportunity to use its own climate survey as the statute allows it to do, and therefore is requesting this exemption. This exemption is also important because the statute makes clear that alternatively, the State Board of Education can create areas of content for the school climate survey, and we're asking that if we're not given the waiver completely, that we be given just areas of content that the school will address. And then lastly, after this law was passed and after the rule was made, the legislature enacted another statute, Utah Code Section 53E 9-203, which prohibits the school from creating surveys and issuing surveys that ask about certain subjects, including mental or psychological problems, sexual behavior, orientation or attitudes, illegal antisocial behavior, religious affiliation, things like that, that they can't ask those questions without gaining parent approval. And at this point in the school year, it's going to be very difficult to do that. And therefore, we're asking for you today to recommend that we be granted that waiver. And then we will be obviously taking that up with the State Board of Education at its earliest opportunity. Thank you for your time, and we appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, those tricky mays and shells. That's all the way through the law, right? May and shall. But I'm going to go back to Ms. Stephenson's recommendation that because I'm going to suggest, board, and you make the motion that you choose, but because this is not we're required to take a vote whether or not the state board will be able to hear this waiver, but because it's not in our authorized agreement with this school. It's not even a part of it. It's not, this is not a survey, as Ms. Stephenson indicated, a survey that we use. The information is not something that comes to us directly. We really have no engagement at any point with this survey relative to using it, receiving information from it. It's not part of our contractual agreement with the school. But we still have to make a decision, right? So that it could move forward. So I might recommend that we make a motion that, up to you, board, but I recommend that potentially we can make a motion that would just say that we could move that motion. We don't need to recommend one way or another relative to the motion, just that we're not going to roadblock it, that we're not going to stand in the way, that if this is something they would like to present to the state board, they should be able to do so. And the state board really has jurisdiction over it. Yeah, Vice Chair Phillips, and then Member Smith, I'll come to you.
Mine's one of that I'd like to direct to AG Olson, if I could, and possibly Vice Superintendent Stallings, because I'm not sure where this would be. When we have no jurisdiction or interest in statute or board rule in something, does the statute and board rule that exists that by which we're sort of bound require us to make a decision on a favorable or unfavorable recommendation, or is it more just that the schools are to come to us and ensure essentially that we don't have an interest or any ability to sort of make a decision regarding this before they can see the state board? So I want to make sure that whatever motion we make allows the school to go forward and ask the State Board of Education, and that we don't, by our motion, say or do the wrong thing that would prohibit them from doing that or delay it. Yeah.
Yes, I don't see any problem with doing what Chair Bowles has suggested. When you look at the rule, it doesn't require you. There's a rule that requires the school to come before this board before they can go before the state board, and it doesn't require this board to send it with a recommendation either for or against. That may be what they'd like to see. I don't know that, but I think just doing what, if that's the intent, is to just send it on without a recommendation either for or against. I don't think that's a problem. But I think it's something that the state board should consider, and I wouldn't see a reason to hold it up. But that's, again, not for me. That's for the board to decide. That you can do it how you want to do it.
Mr. Olson's accurate. The rule, it's R 277-121-2, says that in requesting a waiver, we have to make the request to the superintendent, and then under subsection 1 IV Romanet 4, it says in the case of a charter school, a recommendation from the board of the school's authorizer. I don't believe the recommendation has to be yes or no, but I do think there has to be a recommendation of some kind from this board.
Yeah, that we don't see any inhibiting factors from our perspective that the state board should consider. It's up to them to make the decision. Okay, all right. Deputy Stallings, yeah.
I think that based on what you all have been saying, I agree. You don't have to say we support it or we oppose it. But because the language does say in the case of a charter school, the APA's request would need to include a recommendation from the board. It just says a recommendation from the board of the school's authorizer. So I'm not your legal counsel, but you could just say that the board is neutral and recommends that the waiver request move forward, or no, I guess you wouldn't want to say that, or just remain neutral, whatever you'd like to say. But it does say that there needs to be some sort of
Yeah.
statement or recommendation.
And from the keeper of the rules, I always listen carefully when she when she speaks, and for lots of reasons and lots of things, but especially in this as well. So, Member Smith, I had you hold for a while. I know you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
I am really glad that you brought this to us because I agree that there is a bit of a contradiction in the guidance and it is unclear. And so I personally would very much like to see this resolved. And so when we are ready, I would be happy to make a motion.
I think we are ready. Go ahead.
Okay, I would like to move that we allow APA to move forward with their waiver request with the recommendation that the State Board of Education carefully consider the difficulties that the statutes and rules currently impose on schools.
I'd like to second that.
All right, a motion and a second. Now, can I restate it in a way? As
Yes.
Chair, I'm going to restate the motion in this way, that I'm going to go right to the recommendation piece of it, if that's right, that this board recommends that the state board can carefully consider the request for American Preparatory Academy relative to the climate survey that
I actually would like guidance from the state board that would be more broadly applicable because I think they're correct that there are inherent contradictions in the way these two laws and rule are currently stated. So I personally would like to see them address all of that, not just this particular request.
And that's your second, Member.
I'm
Phillips?
also comfortable with that because I think it rightly states what interest we have and where we don't have any jurisdiction. And it also suggests that between this privacy law, the actual and the other statute that deals with this climate survey specifically, as well as board rule, there needs to be some teasing out of what is required of charters in general. But the reason I like this motion is because it essentially says, we don't stand in the way. We'd like to move this forward to be heard by the USBE. And then we would like clarification for APA and other charter schools
Moving forward.
moving forward. I like it.
Okay. All right. Ms. Castillo, it's most important that you have that motion more than the rest of us because it has to be in the minutes correctly. You've got it? Okay. All right. So I'm hearing, we have a motion from Member Smith, a second from Vice Chair Phillips. Any discussion on that motion? I think we understand the motion. Anyone who needs clarification or not? All right. Are we ready to vote? I'm not seeing anyone wanting to comment or debate. So we know that Member Olson is going to abstain from this particular vote, but the rest of us, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And any opposed, nay. So the motion carries unanimously. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming today, APA, and good luck on your discussion moving forward. All right. Okay, back to Director Lambert. Now, I suspect she's going to make the budget just as interesting as she did her director's report. I have no doubt. So here we go.
Oh, I'm going to surprise you. I
No, you
don't know
won't.
if I can make a budget exciting. So in your meeting materials and on the website and UCAP, and we submitted a budget. It is based on prior year expenditures. We also have USB helps us out in calculating our fixed costs, which is the majority of our budget, at least of the budget that we get to use. Actually, the majority of the funds that come to us are flow-through funds in the startup grant or through trainings and mentorings. The legislature did something different this last year, which we very much wanted and fully supported, and that is that they divided up our allocation into 3 buckets. I'm sure that there's a better term for that than buckets, but that's what I use. And we have always tracked our our funds through actually 5 buckets. So we divide it up even more granularly so that we can ensure that we are spending the funds appropriately to their intent. But one of the problems that we continually have is when we go to the legislature, they see this large carry forward balance. But that carry forward balance is in these startup funds because that is just a set allocation. We do know indications from the legislature that there is a desire to maybe adjust maybe how those calculations are figured each year, and so we look forward to working with them in that. But for right now, our budget remained. The allocation remained largely as it was. There were some increases for personnel. There was some statewide, just general increases to match inflation, or at least an attempt to. But I don't think I'm supposed to say that because it wasn't to match inflation. But in any case, the budget is general. We would be open to adjusting it if need be going forward. But the largest allocation is for startup grants. We just use those according to your policy for startup, and that is both for schools that is authorized by this board as well as any other authorizer. And then we have 400,000 that we do for training and mentoring. Those are with our partners. And then you have your main budget, and that is actually we divide it up. And if you look at the different spreadsheets or the different sheets within the file, those are divided up in terms of the allocations that are given. But I am open to any questions that you may have on the specific items. But we do need this approved so we can use it.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone have questions for Director Lambert? I think because we have such a rich history, we know how careful this staff is in spending money. They're very careful about the money they spend and make careful decisions and consider each pot very carefully. And that notion of those carryovers relative to startup funds is something folks, if they forget, they need to understand. I mean, it's just money we have to have depending upon how many schools we authorize. And so that has to be there. Otherwise, there's a shortfall. So, and I also want to acknowledge that really from this legislative session, our legislators were generous this year in funding schools. I know that there are some pieces that we'd say we'd love more in places, but generally they were quite generous, having lived through years when just to continue what I was doing and with the growth, I had to cut $70 million from a budget. So this is a much more comfortable way to work. This is a nice way to do it. Yeah.
I just want to make sure too that board members, I know our staff already does this, but we as board members need to watch carefully and support our staff when the legislators in session doing the best they can. So this isn't a criticism of either individuals or their processes or committees, but they see a bundle of money sitting over there and it appears that we're not using it and it needs to come back into the general fund and maybe be used for something else. I can't remember a session so far when I've been on this board, or even before I was on this board, when pro-charter and pro-education individuals didn't have to vigilantly guard the actual needed funds for charter schools and just for our public districts and even our small districts. So we have to make sure we're never asleep at the wheel, or some of these really important programs to our charter schools will disappear, or they will be significantly undermined. So that's just, be vigilant.
Yeah.
And thank you to our staff for being vigilant always.
Absolutely, and continuing to represent that. Yeah, that's why I wanted to mention those startup funds again too. And I think Ben Leishman has a good handle on what we do too, and the superintendents at this state board also help us to watch carefully, and they have voice in that and help to represent it. But when you realize that legislators this year, I was at the legislature one day that the speaker said, I know all of you are feeling impatient that your bills are not being completed in time, faster. He said, we've already completed 50 more bills than we considered in the entire 2022 session. And I think there were like 113 education bills passed just this year. And Deputy Superintendent Stallings knows that because she now has to go back and write rules for all of those and help to make sure those things are implemented. So I only mention that because we do have to be vigilant, as Vice Chair Phillips said, not because they don't want to do a good job for us, because they have so much to consider that it can get lost if we don't talk about it and just remind. So we appreciate this was actually quite a good year for them, but we have to sometimes just, if we need to remind, it's not because they're trying to do something to us, but because it just gets lost, and a good reminder helps. So thank you for that reminder for us to be vigilant. All right, so Director Lambert wants to be able to use that money. In order to do that, we have to make a motion to accept the proposed budget from our staff. So I'd be happy to entertain a motion unless someone has more questions or discussion prior. Member Olson.
I move that we approve the proposed budget.
All right, a motion to accept the proposed budget by Member Olson. Is there a second to that motion?
I will second that motion.
And a second from Member Smith. Any further discussion about the budget? Not seeing any, I'll call for a vote. All those of you in favor of that motion say aye.
Aye.
And any opposed, nay. It passes again unanimously. Thank you for your careful work in putting that together. And that's what, and it doesn't just happen in one meeting. It happens because of a great history. We know how careful you are. I want to go back to, I didn't acknowledge, and I should have, that Ms. Stephenson, thank you. I should, for your preparation also in helping us to know how to prepare for APA, and I should have said that as we concluded that. Thank you. That also helps us as we move forward. So thank you for that. And we're ready to move to our school year, our fiscal year 24 meeting schedule. It's that time again. I know. Want me just to talk about, you're going to mention some things. Go ahead. Why don't you, Director Lambert? Yeah, thank you.
So according to your bylaws, you have to adopt a schedule either April, May, or June. I think it gives you the 3 months. So we're just trying to give you as much time as possible so you can plan your schedules. As you know, that we typically meet on the second Thursday of the month. And so that is what was put for most of the meetings that we put in. The State Board of Education is gracious to allow us to use their board rooms, and they help us with the IT and this streaming. And but there's at least historically 2 months in the year that they change their schedule, and that is January, because they typically meet the first Thursday and Friday of the month, but January, that makes it very fast after the holidays. And so they often move their January meeting. And then March, the section usually is ending right. So they usually move their meeting as well in March. And so we, along with Chair Bowles, we suggested some dates, but it's proposed, and I don't know if you want to have a discussion or if you just want to accept it, but the calendar is in the meeting materials that was sent and posted.
Right. And I think sometimes the state board also in January then meets with the USBE convention that month as well. They kind of have their meetings all day and then go to that meeting as well. So there's some other things that go on outside, and so that they can consider the elements of the legislature. Obviously in March, they need to have their meeting a little later, and it allows us to have a little later meeting as well, and we can consider legislative items that might affect us directly too. We can go through those. Any other discussion relative to that proposed calendar? Anyone noting anything that is problematic you want to talk about first? Okay, yeah, Vice Chair Phillips.
Just a quick reminder, it's nothing that we would maybe have to pass today, but sometimes we've done 2 days in January, depending on how many proposals
True.
Or full applications we need to consider. And then there have been just a few times in the last handful of years when we've had to do an additional mini meeting either in January or February to consider the board's position on legislative matters as those unfold.
Absolutely.
So just.
Thank you. So we can always amend this calendar as we go along. This gives us a beginning framework at least. And if we need to add an additional day, we can amend and we can do those kinds of things as we need to. So just get us a framework started especially so we can have rooms reserved and we have a place to meet. That's good reminders for us. And anyone have any further discussion? All right, I'm be glad to take a motion.
I move to approve the 24 meeting schedule as outlined.
All right, so for Member Bassett, a proposal to accept the proposed fiscal year, school year 24 meeting schedule. Anyone who'll second that motion?
I will second it.
And a second from Vice Chair Phillips. It's kind of like in What's My Line? Will the real someone stand up? We all are looking at each other to make that motion. Okay, so any discussion? Not seeing any, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor of the motion to approve this schedule, say aye.
Aye.
And any opposed, nay. All right, we have a meeting set up moving forward. Now, at this point, we are going to not adjourn our meeting, but recess our meeting for maybe 5-10 minutes. If you want to run to the restroom, we'll start a little later downstairs, but we're going to move downstairs to Basement West. Everyone, I think, knows where that meeting is, and I know not because we have discussions. Some of the folks who've been with us this morning need to excuse themselves. I know Deputy Superintendent Stallings needs to, and maybe others as well. And we appreciate you having stayed with us this morning. And we'll go downstairs to learn anything, Director Lambert, we should know in that move as we go downstairs.
So there are signs up. We don't have assigned seats, so you will notice there's a smaller kind of square for board members to sit. There will also be lunch down there that you can grab and eat as you want, but feel free to sit wherever you want on the square, and staff will be around you. And
thank you so
yeah.
much. All right, so let's recess for 10 minutes. We'll reassemble at 11:30 downstairs. And as Director Lambert said, sit where you'd like in that smaller group and pick up a lunch if you're ready for that. And we'll have a working lunch and a learning session. Okay, see you downstairs.
Okay, we're good. All right, well, I just wanted to say thank you for allowing me this. As we're going to talk about the SCSB metric outliers today, and if you recall from the March meeting, Dr. Williams had presented financial review. Member Smith had asked to know more about the outliers that Dr. Evans has referred to during that.
Look at they respond like that. Just pointing out.
These are amazing.
Just pointing out.
Yeah, and so that's what this is about, giving you more information on what those are. All right, the first one we're going to talk about is the cash flow outliers, and just kind of want to give you an idea of the metric itself. So the cash flow metric is calculated by, it's a difference in the cash from one period to the next. So in this case, it would be the difference in cash from June 30th of 2021 June 30th, 2022 audit reports. Right. So the first ones we're going to talk about are the outliers for a positive cash flow. And these are the schools that are determined to be outliers for the positive cash flow. And as you can see, there is a great deal of variance even here. It goes from approximately 2 million to 5 million. And if you look at Syracuse Arts Academy, you can see it's actually almost $3 million above the next school. So it's actually kind of an outlier for the outliers that way. And we'll talk a little bit about the reasons for this, but something I want you to notice is you're going to see a lot of these schools show up again. The one I want you to pay particular attention to is Syracuse Arts Academy, because it's not going to show up in the same place that the other ones did. All right, so we're talking about the differences, the reasons for the outliers for a positive cash flow. The first one was differences between a bond issue and a capital outlay. This was actually the case for Syracuse Academy. They had received a bond issue that year, so they had a lot of cash inflow, but they hadn't expended all of that in their project yet. So that's why they have such a high amount of cash on hand. Online schools with low facility costs, you would expect them to see them, especially if it's a larger school, to have high changes in cash flow, just because their facility costs are so low, but they're still receiving the same amount per student. Another one, and this was a big one, was the reclassification of cash from restricted to unrestricted. So when I mentioned how we calculated, I failed to mention that we're calculating it on unrestricted cash, not total cash. So if a school has reclassified cash during the year, it can have a big effect on this. There was one school where it was actually about $2.7 million that was reclassified, which made a huge difference.
So I want to know why would some restricted monies, how can they become reclassified?
Okay, so restricted, for this particular metric, the restrictions are based on loan covenants. So if for some reason they just had reached a level that it changed what they needed to have.
For debt service instead that they.
So they've already met their debt service.
Yeah.
Or their bondholders say you can go ahead and spend that on HVAC.
So they might not necessarily have really received a great deal of cash, but there was just a reclassification. Right? A larger LEA. This one in particular is like your APA, right? They have 6 schools. So you're going to see that they're able to maintain a higher level of cash. If you look at it proportionally, it's not necessarily higher than another school. It would be a normal range. And you're going to see that actually as you look at where the other schools show up as outliers. You'll see this one on this of the next metric, but when we get into the ratios, it's not going to show up as an outlier. And that's why it's just a larger LEA, so it shows up. The outliers for negative cash flow, we had less of them, and you can see that it ranged from negative about 300,000 to over 2 million. Let's talk about that. So reasons for outliers for negative cash flow. And this first one may kind of seem counterintuitive. If the school has long-term debt being paid, so long-term debt being paid out of cash reserves. So if they're not holding on to enough, if they don't have enough in their regular revenues to pay that long-term debt off, then they're going to have to go into their cash reserves to get that money. And so you'll see it that's happening. A large cash outlay of prior years payables. So there was a school that had a great deal of payables at the end of the fiscal year, the prior fiscal year. Now they might have had the cash to take care of those, and they just hadn't taken care of it. So, if they paid it in this fiscal year, you can see their cash go down. So it could be that they either had the cash on hand when it was due and just hadn't paid it yet, or it could be that they're paying it out of their current revenues, which the first case, it wouldn't be so bad. That case, that would be something we want to know more about. If they're intending to invest in capital assets, they may be holding on to cash to make sure that they're able to pay those off. So they're making sure that what they're holding on to high. And then the one where we saw the $2 million, it was over $2 million. That was actually a prepayment of a large expense. So they had made a $2 million prepayment. I don't know if it was an expense necessarily or a capital outlay, but it was a prepayment. So that's not continuing. That'll be taken care of. Subsequent years expense. All right, let's talk about the change in net position. So again, the change in net position, this is calculated by subtracting the expenses from the revenues. And these are the schools that we see are the outliers for the positive change in net position. Again, we have a big expense. It goes from 1.4 million to 5.5 million. Again, you'll see American Preparatory on here because it's a larger school, but talk about other reasons why. Outliers for negative, for changing it. I apologize. Okay. So reasons for outliers for positive change in that position. This is the one that I was referring to that seems kind of counterintuitive. Is if they have high debt service costs for principal, and you would wonder, well, why would that make them have a high change in that position? Because there would be money going out. But I'm just going to give you a really short accounting lesson, just in case you need it, on how long-term liability is reported in the financial statement. So when a school has debt service, it doesn't show up in revenues. It's put as a liability on the change in net position. Statement of change in net position is the name of the statement. And when it's paid, it just reduces the liability. So it never hits the expenses. So if you have a school that has a large principal amount that it needs to pay during the school year, then they're going to actually have a high change in that position, because that net position is where they're going to pay that principal amount out of.
Meaning that they still have to book that amount, and then appears as though they have that, and they will over the year, but not immediately.
So it's not going to show up as an expense. So they're going to have this great looking change in that position, but the cash is actually coming out. So that change in that position is where what they're holding on to, and that change in that position is what they need principal amount out.
Gotcha.
All right. They may have a potential savings for a planned expenditure coming up. So again, they're holding on to their revenues for that, and a larger LEA. All right, outliers for negative change in net position. These are the schools that were in this category. As you can see, again, it's about 300,000 to over $2 million. About that. So the reasons for outliers for negative change in that position, basically due to debt issuance costs. And I wanted to show you a next. This is where Syracuse Arts Academy showed up again. And as we saw, Syracuse Arts Academy blew it out of the water in having cash. And now they have a negative change in debt position of $1,000. And the reason for that is debt issuance costs. Whenever a school has received a debt issuance, there are costs that are associated with that that are very expensive. It's not cash going out, it's just withheld from the proceeds, but it's all booked in 1 year. So it's not uncommon for a school to have a negative change in that position when they have those debts.
Are these capital dollars also, Lisa? Syracuse, for example.
So for Syracuse, this would be part of their debt, their bond.
So they're to purchase their building as opposed
yes.
to, they have been leasing, at least at one point. I know they leased a building, so they now are purchasing, and so it's capital bond
Right, this
expenditure.
has, yeah, but this does hit the expense.
Gotcha.
And a newer school, as they're starting to build up their reserves and going forward, you would see, it would be common to see them a large negative amount.
And it would be a net liability versus assets position as well in those
Right,
years
right.
until they build up their
Yep,
principal.
you're going to see a lot of liability. And then obviously a decrease in enrollment.
Are any of our schools in that category?
These
The outliers.
More problematic to us than.
Far more problematic. So tell us about which school that was.
And by the way, some of those are not in financial trouble. They just, after COVID, open to net negative compared to what it had been, but not necessarily net negative.
average over time.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
That we have our metrics and what causes us to look further. And you see, you have someone looking at it who can understand and dig into why is this? Because it makes a huge difference on the why. For sure. So if we're bringing one to you and we're saying this is a problem, we do understand that there's these other reasons, but we're all.
But you're just
So-
raising the flag to say there's something you looked at.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what we do. That's why we don't have like those automatic triggers, right? We have that research and review. Someone like Lisa and also Sprinty can look. Something you should be concerned
And then this one kind of would definitely happen if you had a decrease in enrollment, but it could also happen if this was not watching their budget carefully and then.
Obviously the most problematic. of all
Exactly.
for us.
Okay, now let's talk about the current ratio outliers. Current ratio is calculated by dividing your current assets and your current assets into cash within the next. We're dividing that by current liabilities, and your current liabilities are anything that's becoming the next 12 months. And also you will see in that any long-term debt that is going to be due 12 months is compared to the current portion of the debt and will be. These are the schools that were outliers for a high current ratio. High current ratio is what we want. The standard is actually that it be 1 or greater than or equal to 1. And we have a lot of fluctuation here. We have it go from about 8 to 100. The reasons for outliers for a high current ratio would be when there's little to no long-term debt. Obviously, you don't have that current portion of debt showing up in the liabilities, which would bring that. So when you're seeing 113, that's where you would see that. And they have a healthy cash balance. So if they have a lot of cash in there, that increases their numerator. So it's going to be higher in outliers for current ratio of less than 1. A few of these, they go from 0.51 to 0.99. So 0.99 is actually close to the standard, which is good. And a newer school, again, for the same reasons we talked before. Being a school. They have high current liabilities. Then you would see this as well. Again, talking about, is it liabilities that they just failed to pay before the end of the school year? Or is it something they're intending to pay with? That would be more concerned. Also, a current portion of long-term debt is exceeding the available. Debt to asset ratio outliers. So debt to asset ratio is calculated by dividing total debt by total assets. So it's actually the inverse relationship of the current ratio. So whereas we wanted it to be 1 or more, on the current ratio, we want to see it less than 1 actually. Outliers for low debt to asset ratio are here, ranged from 0 to 0.16. The reasons for the outliers for the low debt to asset ratio, little to no long-term debt would be a great reason why they would have this again. And that's pretty much the only thing that would. Okay, outliers for a high debt to asset ratio. We have these that goes from 1.08 to 1.25, which 1 is concerning. So if we're getting up to that 0.25, we definitely want to look more at that. Reasons for outliers for high debt to asset ratio is long-term debt higher than net capital assets. And basically the only difference between this one and the current ratio is you're adding in capital assets and you're adding in long-term debt. So that's why the long-term debt is really your basic factor in this range.
That have a very low number there are the ones that.
Okay, total margin outliers. Total margin is calculated by dividing your change in net assets by total revenue. The outliers for a high total margin are the schools we have here. So from almost, and I like to talk about total margin in terms of percentage. Decimal form here, but we'll talk about it. So it goes from about 18 to 30. Reasons for an outliers for total margin, and this was, I saw this in a couple of schools, was there was a large one-time revenue source. So if there's something one-time large coming in and they haven't planned on spending it for the fiscal year, that's going to bring that percentage. Increases in funding without commensurate increases in expense. If you have a school that's trying to manage its expenses and keep it low, and you get that'll bring that up. Low long-term debt, therefore low interest expense. So for the debt, you have the principal portion is over on your statement of position, but the interest on it is on your statement of activities. So it's going to show up in the calculation for the change in net assets. So if they have a low interest expense, and mostly it's so they're covering things with the principal is basically what they're paying, then you're going to see this total margin figure go up. Yeah, and that's actually without them really having much change in. So outliers for a negative total margin, these ranged from about 6% to, again, around 30, 31. These are the schools that were in this category. One of the reasons for this, again, debt issuance costs. They're very expensive. They come out all at once, so it's going to bring. And actually, one thing is that you would notice if you every single school that was an outlier for a negative total margin was an outlier for the negative net change. A newer school, again, lots of expenses. Revenue decreases. Enrollment would be. This is our last metric, which is unrestricted days cash on hand. This one is basically calculated by the money that it costs to run the school. You divide that by 365 days, and you divide the unrestricted portion by that to determine how many days restricted days cash on hand they have. One good thing was for the high unrestricted days, and there were a lot of them. This is actually one of 2 pages. Changed. The high point was 519 days. 213 was low on this unrestricted days cash. Lots of schools. Talk about why that would be. Again, the reclassification from restricted cash to unrestricted would be a reason that this is high as well. Online schools with little to no debt and low facility costs because they're able to maintain that much easier. Schools, I saw this a lot. Schools that look like they were just working to maintain it or even increase their plans over several years. If a school is planning a capital outlay, they'll want to be accumulated. And then a one-time revenue source, a large one again. Outliers for low and restricted days cash on hand. This is fairly low number of schools. It did range from a -5 to 26. The standard is actually 30. That's what we want them to maintain. Where you see this negative amount, it's just they were dipping into their restrictions. Reasons for outliers here. These are pretty, if it's an outlier in this category, it's definitely concerning. something we want to look at. So significant decreases in enrollment cause this. LEA's inability to mitigate expenses and debt service costs using current. Basically, that's it for my presentation. That was my last one. If you have more questions, I'll be happy to do my best to answer them. Thank you for your time.
I just have a question.
Yes.
I love when schools are able to kind of have a little security bundle, right? But I'm not gonna lie, it bugs me a bit when I look at the number of cash on hand that some schools have. And I think to myself, if you save that much money, what could you be giving to students?
Exactly.
So I know we love to see, we're kind of oohing and awing at the people who have saved all this money and then kind of all worried that somebody's -5, which I am worried about, by the way. So I don't want to minimize that.
Right.
Wait, what's going on over there? But when I see somebody with 500 days of cash on hand, I think stop being stingy and spend that money on the kids. I mean, if you don't, let's say you are a virtual school, what can you do because of that? Because they're not coming to a building every day that someone's paying for, to enrich that in a way, because that's the kids' money.
Yes.
So I'm bugged by that, actually. I'm bugged by those outliers that have too much cash on hand. I want them to have enough.
Right.
And I want them to have enough so that they could provide for somebody even if they have to do it out of general funds, for somebody who comes in with really big needs that is on a very, very involved IEP. Or some other thing, oh my goodness, we have to replace all of our whatever, our entire roof or whatever. You should have enough to not feel insecure because we don't have any ability to levy taxes.
Right. And a lot of those that I did see that were on that list, or they had very little fluctuation. And so they were trying to maintain a certain level. I couldn't tell necessarily what that level was, but you could see that it was a maintaining. My guess would be if they're maintaining, they have a reason why they picked that amount. But like you said, like the 519.
That's inexcusable, really.
What is that? And
you go back.
And that is
Who
winter
is the 500?
sports. I'm sorry.
That was winter
Yeah.
sports.
Can actually, because we've talked about this a lot.
I thought that you could tell.
Some of these schools, like winter sports, they came from being a private school. So they came kind of with those days cash on hand. And because
So
they're
we're public monies at the time.
correct, because they're maintaining and not necessarily increasing, what you're seeing is they are spending the money that they're given, but they do have this reserve of just in case. And winter sports school is a smaller school to begin with. And so, yeah, I do think 500 is maybe a little bit much, but they might have good reasons to have a little more of a cushion than maybe what other schools might be comfortable with.
And I agree with Cindy with that too, relative to that number, but I think you've outlined why, and Lisa did as well. Most importantly, if they have that much, you really want to know what's your plan for them. Is it just willy-nilly you've stated that, or you purposely have that much because have something coming in or two that you want given, or you have a plan?
Yeah.
You're just finding
Even
out.
a
I know
capital
those are the
expense.
questions you're asking.
If it's a capital expense. But I will say, we do get some criticism for this as charters. Now, of course, there are a whole bunch of charters that we desperately wish had more cash on hand. That's more the problem than this one. But there is something to be said. I mean, look at the way the legislature scrutinized our little bit of funds that actually were completely earmarked, not even for our institution, but for new charters.
Yeah.
I do think that, when we see a school that isn't really using the funds, because we have to ask why. That's it. The winter sports is different.
Perfect, yeah. Perfect.
But there were there were 2 pages and 4 columns of those people, not just winter sports school. There were 4 different columns, and I can't, I don't know all the details of those schools, but I doubt that all of them transition from private to public or have a capital expense plan. That's money in the bank, and I don't think it should be there. I think it should be spent on the kids.
So did we see an overall increase in cash on hand this last couple of years?
And overall.
by our
Yes.
schools? Because I know that.
Yes, due to
Probably
funds
COVID
from
funds.
COVID.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so that's, you're partly seeing that where the schools just haven't. And in some ways, it's also smart to, that if you're getting a large increase in funds, you don't want to just spend it and then be poor your other years. And so they might just be kind of slowing down.
Or you burn down the COVID funds and then you can keep your money.
Right.
Yeah, and that was one of the factors was large one-time.
Sort of our target for base cash.
Well, so 30 is our standard.
And that
30 days.
just, that's low.
Yeah.
But 30 just means you can afford to float your month.
Right. Exactly.
Well, and it also does make a difference. Right before their, the revenue, check hits, or is it right after? Because some of these, if they're doing it right after and they're hitting, 33 days cash on hand, we see.
They really bring us to the end of the month.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things to look at and consider.
Well, bondholders are probably gonna have much higher days cash on hand performance too, 45 to 60, right? So you're gonna have these schools that have, they're honoring their bond covenant, they're probably gonna be closer to 60. So if you had a really healthy days cash on hand, and then you got $20 billion in COVID funds, right? And you can't spend it that fast realistically. So you do have a nice, I can't imagine over time we're gonna see 200 even. Right, like I would be really surprised if in the next couple of
80 or 90
settle down into
is
the
good.
100.
Yeah, 80 or 90 is
Oh
good.
yeah, there were days when if you had 45, you were doing the right. So
we have had some discussion with staff, like, do we want to have like a cap of, days cash? But it just gets so hard.
Well, that makes
Agree
sense.
to- I think it just.
Because it's so individual.
Schools can save for large capital expenditure. We want to allow them to do that.
But just to play the devil's advocate again, those COVID funds are supposed to be spent on the kids too. Not supposed to add to the budget. Not really. They're supposed to be spent for remediation, devices, sectioning out rooms, all the things that were allowable on those lists. And so, and we're kind of desperate as public schools, so we do kind of put a little bit of it away. But that's a fine line. At some point, you're robbing the kids.
and I'm with you, Vice Chair Phillips, because it's hard to make an argument to say we need a WPA increase when I've got, all this
Right.
money sitting in the bank accumulating revenue. But I think because we don't have the taxing benefit and we have inflation, I think it makes, as a charter board, you're gonna be nervous right now to deviate too far from a traditional budget. So I think for at least the next little bit, we wouldn't want to put that strain on any of our schools. And then if we do start seeing material costs come down and we start seeing it being wise to enter the construction market, you might have schools that, right, okay, now we have enough cash to move forward onto the
To do the
improvement,
thing we wanted to do.
right, that they haven't been able to do because of how unreasonable construction costs have been. They haven't been able to enter the market. So
Right.
I just think we have to ask those questions because find balance. We have to have enough, be secure, but we can't hoard it and then act all poor
yeah,
about
right.
salaries and about, we don't have enough to buy a new math curriculum. And, oh yeah, you do. You have to buy 10 math curriculums with 500 days cash on hand.
Especially with them extending Lincoln Fillmore's bill of being able to transfer.
35%
Right?
flexibility.
That's a huge benefit.
Exactly.
So I suspect we all share that same philosophy. Money is there to be spent on kids, but at the same time to be fiscally wise so that you don't damage kids in the long run because you close, you don't have money there. And so thank you for all of the charter team that you have in mind. That just makes me know you've got in mind really clear targets and flags you're looking at and to ask the right questions and say, where are folks relative to that? And can we prevent problems before they happen? And how can we advise schools relative? What's your plan? What are you doing with it? What's your plan when you don't have enough? What are we gonna do? How are you gonna do that?
And in all honesty, that's probably where our primary focus is because that's, those are the
that's
ones that
scary.
are most immediate.
Well, thank you for that. And Member Smith for asking a question and thank you for being so quickly responsive and also saying in language that we could accounting language we could understand.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. At least come closer to. Thanks.
That's
Thank you
really-
so much.
really helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank
You did a great job. And now we're going to have, the annual targets report is Sal, Director Lambert, Andrew together. Doing this one right?
Yeah, I'm gonna move over here, so.
It's both of us, right?
Yeah. I have to say, you're only gonna see whatever the slides are, 2 slides, but a ton of work has gone into the background on this. So this isn't just gonna be a report. We actually are looking at presenting to you things that we feel might be better targets and better just look at things so that it's more we wanted you to be able to think about it, to digest it, but in the future, we would bring to you some new policies or new documents to maybe. Just want to give you some brief historical context. So when I very first was hired as a data person, now Andrew, I was tasked with coming up with some performance standards. And at that time, it was called the CSPS, the Charter School Performance Standards. And we built something that was based on, before I started, I contracted with Credo, which is a policy center out of Stanford, to help identify what could be good targets. We also used NACSA. Combining all of that, we came up with the Charter School. Now, there was a lot of benefit in the standard, but the biggest drawback is we didn't really know how to use them. I mean, we knew how to use them, but we got the data, and then we really struggled to know, well, what is good, and so every school had a score. In some of the meetings, the board would look at, well, okay, let's bring in the top 25% and the bottom 25% and have them, different meetings, of course, but have them talk about why. The downside of that is that you always have a bottom 25% and always have a top 25%. And so we then convened, and I know we convened a work group of charter representatives, and we said, how can we improve this? What can we do moving? And we came up with the Charter School Accountability CSAP. And that is still what we have today. But in there, we did find some drawbacks to it. And one of the drawbacks is vision between the 5-year and annual. A little confusing and mixed up. The idea was that at the 5-year, the comprehensive review, that's where the designations would be assessed, and some of you have been involved in that. Years is a long time to have a designation. It is far too long. Schools are doing things. So we really, as staff, we really choked over giving anyone less than good standing because it lasted for 5 years. That just did not seem fair or our values. Also, we were looking at the statute, and the comprehensive review focuses on the charter agreement performance. That's what we're focusing now on the comprehensive performance team led by Dr. Evans is doing a really great job of having those discussions with schools, and it's a great opportunity to talk about updating the charter so that we don't have charters referencing old laws, and it's done in a way that's it's been very positive, and I've been some of that feedback that we've had. But then that leaves us, we are required to do an annual. And that's what we've really been thinking about. Instead of trying to divide it out, we want the annual review, or it was just to catch, as I would say, and this may be a bad way of putting it, but the schools that are screaming, those that are really in trouble that we need to intervene. And that kind of got lost in the transition. Also with like the financial metrics,
split those up, like the one that were supposed to be more multi-year metrics, like some of the total margin or some of the things that went over. Put those out of the annual review, so we stopped focusing on them, but then we lost something because as you saw, you really have to look at all of the metrics together instead of just in. And so we're now looking at making it a way more robust, but also in a way more useful so that we can every year. And the idea and the goal with the annual is to be able to identify the schools that we need to look at. What schools do we focus on that year to see, do they need support? Is it something that's completely explainable, we don't need to worry about, or something that. So as I said, there was a lot of work that went behind this. Andrew is our new dean with, I think, and anyway, he has looked at 10 years of data, and that's the positive thing. When I was back looking at, I did not have as many years of data as what Andrew has been able to get around with. And so we were trying to figure out what's the best way of putting this. So the recommendations, we came up with compassionate statistics again, and to our values. The idea is that we were looking at really statistically what makes the most sense, but then we were looking at, okay, what also makes common sense, and with understanding where we don't want to set the bar in a place that's going to be too hard. Yes, we don't want to set it too low, but we don't. So I'm going to
also, we don't want it at 82.34567%.
Yeah, as Andrew knows, I like round numbers. I kept trying to push him to that, and he kept going, no, but that's not where the cut is. So I'm going to turn it to Andrew so he can kind of show off some of the things. We promise it's not going to be too statistical.
We have some of us. I'm going to stand up. I can't really sit still. So as Jennifer talked about, we looked at 10 years of data from all of the enrollment metrics from every single school. Schools that didn't have 10 years of data, we took all of the years that they have. We looked at correlations between the metrics, and we also ran a factor analysis, which takes all of the data and then compartmentalizes it and tries to fit it into groups, right? Into these groups. And we found that almost all of the data, 70% of the variance fell within 2 groups, which is a lot. And these 2 main groupings were a school's ability to attract students and the school's ability to keep students, right? So we have a percent of max enrollment and enrollment trend, and the transfer rate and retention.
Can I just, because that was like a big aha moment that we had, is that when we were really thinking about these, and we were thinking about, because we've only in the past really looked at an enrollment trend, and that trend was only for one, a lot of drawbacks Andrew will show. And then we were looking at the transfer rate and retention rate. Now, the percent of max enrollment, that Andrew will also talk about that. But as we were thinking about this, they really are telling us different things. And so if you think about when we're looking at new schools, we always ask for the market. Is there a market? And really the percent of max and the enrollment trend is kind of giving us information about the market. A lot of those things are not always in the school's control. We can see some schools where they're going down because they're in a depressed area, economically depressed. Transfer rate and retention rate gives us a little more indication of maybe what's going on, right? If you have a lot of students leaving, you might actually be able to keep really of it because you or the idea of the school itself is just a really great and needed school for the area, but maybe there's some problems in how it's being operated, and so it's telling us different things.
Yeah, I'll also add that factor analysis is very sophisticated. So yeah, it's been fun. Pass it off like it was easy, but I'm here folks need to know it's not.
And that's not the only, he's done other
Things that didn't end up working out very well, things that ended up not necessarily contributing to what we needed. So I'm gonna start with our so whats. So we have identified flaws in our current enrollment trend, right? We identified flaws in how the group of students or in how schools attract students is being interpreted and used by us, right? We identified flaws in that structure. And our goal with this presentation, with potentially shifting the metrics, that was the proposal today, and adding in a couple of different things, is not a punitive measure, right? The goal is not to come down on schools, but to create a system of early detection and also to create a support infrastructure, so that before things are screaming, and say, hey, other schools that have gone down this road, here's what's occurred. Here are some things that we've seen are helpful, right? So we can help create that support structure and to early detection so that schools can potentially course correct before anything even problematic. So with the enrollment trend, it was really difficult to design this, right? We found that the current enrollment trend, which is year, right? So basically like 2023 enrollment divided by 2022 enrollment, right? Isn't actually a trend, it's just 1 year. And so when you look at that over a course of multiple years, you're not really seeing anything valuable. It does not capture long-term viability in the slightest. And also, for some schools, is not giving us useful information, right? A school during COVID went skyrocketed with their enrollment and then dropped down the next year. There's still 200 students above where they were to start with. It's showing them that our metric is triggering an automatic R&R, which doesn't make any sense. Yeah. So this is supposed to indicate if there's a metric or a market for the school, but it wasn't doing that. And so we've designed it into a 3-part metric, which has a 1 year, a 3-year average, and a 5-year average. And when we were going back and forth with this, we were kind of wrestling. Jennifer said, well, do we only need 3? I was like, well, let me look at it and let's determine whether or not we need 3-year or we could just use 5-year or both of them. Found that each of these uncovers things the other was high. We're going to get into that right now. So if we take a look at this, we have 2 different schools here, and the numbers have been changed slightly so that nobody can go back and say like, oh, this is this specific school, right? So we see that these are using just a regular enrollment trend that we've been using for the past couple of years. And at first glance, these schools look to be doing pretty good, right? School A is kind of dipping downward, but kind of stabilizing. Doesn't seem to be really problematic. And then school B had this massive upshoot and then this massive fall. But overall, it seems to be doing good, right? Here's an example of as it currently stands, right? So 2015 enrollment is 525, 2014 enrollment is 575, and so this division gives us. Now, metric, right? So if we just take this and we apply the enrollment trend numbers to it, we see something very different picture. We see that school A is doing very well these first 2 years. And then from this 109% down to 85%. So this enrollment trend is actually showing a decrease, 25% of their students. And then if you take 100% of these students, by the next year, you're seeing a decline of another 25, another 10%, and decline again. So you're actually seeing, sorry, not 10%, you're seeing a decline of 25% from this year's. And then you're seeing a 20% decline from this year's. In school B, what you're seeing is huge growth, gigantic growth, and what looks like problems. When you look at the actual data numbers, they have more different picture, right? So we see that school A's enrollment from 2022 has dropped half. So you can see that our enrollment trend metric is broken. That all of these schools, both of these schools are meeting our metric to a 70%. They're in the median category, which would mean that we're not even looking at them to determine whether or not they're doing well. So see here that school B, their enrollment here is up from here, and then is even higher, 200 students higher than their massive up, but it looks like they have a huge 30% decline. So this is messy, and we'll kind of break it down, right? So we have three lines here. the 1-year trend, which is what we had before. We have the 3-year trend line, we have a 5-year trend line. Right, so why there's not anything back here was because the school didn't have enough years, right? So this year is going to take 5 years prior as well, right? And so you see that each of these is telling a different story, right? That if we just had 3-year trend and not the 1 year or the 5-year, that this school would look perfectly fine and there would be no change and no reason to look at them at all, right? If we just have this 1 year, they're on an R&R. If we have this 5-year, we're seeing a little bit more of an appropriate picture. And so for this one, the 5-year is the most important one to look at, right? But for another school, the 3-year might be more important to look at because in those 3 years, they might have had a big spike or a big fall. But the 5-year, because we're looking at more years, has flattened that curve. And so in some cases, they're more important to look at different ones for different schools. And so by having them all three, we can see a larger and more appropriate picture of what's actually going on with the school. This year, this school has really high kind of ups and downs and kind of random, it looks like kind of random big ups and high, gains and falls. And the 3-year here shows a very kind of variable picture where the 5 years is more stable. And so this one would be one where the 3-year is more important to look at and to understand to see what's actually going on with this. So what with the enrollment trend? 1-year trend's not a trend. By only using the 1 year, we're missing all of the important information that's necessary for us and for schools to understand how well they're doing. And as we saw here, each trend shows things the other side, right? For certain schools, 5-year or 3-year or 1 year shows things that the other ones are kind of hiding. It's by their design. So what we see here is the histogram of both of these data sets. This is 10 years of 3-year enrollment trend data and 10 years of 5-year enrollment trend data. So we see kind of different things with these. The lines are where our proposed cutoffs are, right? So for this one, we see a very narrow histogram with almost all the schools. You see like 400 of the 800 schools are just in this little, this here right next to the mean, right? The mean at almost true zero. And then we have this kind of small outlier section. But with the 5-year, we're looking at more years. And so you have a far broader histogram, and you have more outliers on these ends, right? And you have less people kind of in this. It goes only up to 80, right, with these two here. So now when we look at kind of where these metrics are proposed to be set, we'll look at kind of why. The 3-year enrollment trend, this is where our pre-change cutoffs were, and this is where we're proposing that they be. Look at the data here. You see that the pre-change cutoffs, that almost the entire data set is in this meeting or exceeding category. Almost the entire data set. So this is like, these are outliers. It's statistically outliers. This is more than one standard deviation out. So like 85% of the data set is in this meeting or exceeding category, which with our goal here of early detection and understanding how a school is doing is not giving us information. It's not helping us to understand what a school needs and how to go about them being successful. And so we see here that our far below category, there's like no schools here. This is like 5 schools, 6 schools in our far below category. And basically no schools in the not meeting category as well. Like 15 schools in our not meeting category. So if we have like a total of 20 or 30 schools out of 800, a 10-year data set, it means that it's not statistically appropriate to be set in this ones. What we did was we looked at the statistics and said, where is it appropriate to set them? And wherever the statistics said to set them, we pulled it a little bit below to make sure that it was more appropriate using human eyes to see how many schools, what's the percentage of schools that might fit into these categories, and use humans along with the statistics to determine that. So here we see that in this meeting category, we still have a lot of the data set, almost, far more than half of the data set in there that are not meeting category is more appropriate, and that only our outliers are in the far below category. I'm gonna look at the 5-year trend. Sorry, This is still a 3-year, and here are our proposed metrics, right? You're saying, Andrew, why are you proposing to set a metric below 0? And I'll tell you, it's because that's where the data falls, right? So if our mean is true 0, it doesn't make any sense to set our metric at true 0 because it means that half of our data set is not in, right? Half of our data set would be not meeting or far below, which doesn't make any sense. And so what we looked at was actually where does this feed? Where are we comfortable and where does it work? And that was at that 2% line. That
There, the 0 means that they're staying steady.
yeah, they have exactly the same number of students. Yeah. Over these three, right? They went up 2, they went down 2, they stayed steady.
Did we actually look at how this statistic?
Yes. Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's nice to put where the data term sets it, right? But it's even better if you can correlate actual outcomes.
Yes, almost all of the schools that have failed because of financial struggles due to enrollment struggles.
We're also doing, in addition to, they're working a number of different authorizers, and we're looking at indicators of stress. I think I've talked about this in one of my directors' reports, but one of the things that they're having us do is it is what it is. And where you're going back and they have all of these metrics, and a lot of them aren't easily measured. They're more like qualitative type. But going back and saying, which ones did you see the most prevalent? So yes, that has very much been part of it.
So then, looking at the stop meeting category, we have between -2% over the course of 3 years, and then up to -10%, right? Where those are the schools were saying, this is like something is not going very well, but you're not necessarily at the point yet where we need to be very concerned. But if you are dropping below 10% over the course of those 3 years on average, that's problematic. And then looking at the 5 years, initially Jennifer and I, when we talked about it, we said, well, the 5-year need, like logically, should be more stringent because there's more data, right? And so it's averaging out to be like less impactful overall. But we found when we actually looked at it was because there's more data, there's like a broader spread of data. And so the variation is bigger. And so what we found was that actually -5% is appropriate, statistically appropriate and compassionately appropriate from a human standpoint of making sure that as many schools as is appropriate are in that meeting count. Something you may have noticed is that there's no blue line. Blue line would represent an exceeding category, right? What we found was that in enrollment trend, you can only be exceeding for so long. Why? Because you hit your max enrollment. So if you're in that exceeding category for 5 years and you hit your max cap enrollment, the next year, even if you stay at 100% max capacity, you're no longer exceeding, and that just feels uncomfortable and weird. So that you can only be exceeding for so long. So for enrollment trend and 4% of max, we stripped out the exceeding category. Because it doesn't make sense statistically. So what we see is this -5% here, and then between -5 and -11%, then anyone below the -11% would be in far below. So these are the pre-change cutoffs right here. That schools that were everybody is in the meeting or exceeding category pretty much.
Well, almost everybody or majority are in the exceeding.
The majority are in the exceeding category. Over half the data set is in the exceeding category, which doesn't make any sense, right? So the full proposed cutoffs are here. I can send this out to you guys if you want to take a greater look at it. I'm not voting on anything today. So if you have any questions about these, feel free to voice those now.
The N size was so big, 806, I think you went to it. Yeah, those are still a lot of data points. That's amazing. That was a lot of
data. Yeah.
To get that.
You have any question?
I was just making a statement.
Right. Okay, so moving on to the percent of max authorized category, we found that this needs to be a partner metric with the finance and enrollment trend because some schools we have that have 500 days cash on hand that have a 30% of max. Right, their finances are great. Enrollment percent of max is very poor. It doesn't matter because the school is viable. The school is doing well academically. The school is doing well in all counts, except for this, except for percent of max. And so we found that certain outliers didn't matter. And so this wasn't actually predicting whether or not a school was doing well, unless it was tied to other things. And the factor analysis and our just observation showed that if a school is struggling in the enrollment trend and in percent of max, there's definitely a problem. But if a school's doing well in enrollment trend and really bad in percent of max, there's potentially not a problem, especially if the finances are okay. And so this does not stand on its own any longer unless there's a problem with the enrollment trend. This helps
because we actually had a lot of discussion on whether or not
Keep
to
this at
even
all.
do this, but it did add some information, and as long as it's paired with the others, we did find that it was
It
useful.
still gives you that market. That discussion around market potential, right? Yeah, or not.
Although it has to be contextualized because a lot of these schools come in the max that we authorize and it was never to be. And so if we continue, but yet they have plenty of enrollment to run a great program. So it becomes, it sometimes becomes a non-essential metric, but I can see how it would at other times be paired.
Where they were up at their cap, and then now they're at
So the
30%.
market did at one time support that. Yeah.
Exactly. And so these have been shifted as well. I believe I have
one other comment.
Yeah.
Because we see the decline in school-aged children, which will continue certainly through my lifetime, but through everybody else's lifetime as well in this room. Max may become less and less significant over time.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, especially considering that this year we were given 0 new students in terms of the what is it called, the projections, right? 0 new students, and so some schools are saying, "Well, I need more students. I'm opening a new campus," and we're saying, "Who are we going to take that from?"
They're dividing out the different what they're telling us. We're talking about the max authorized and the trend really do need to be combined. Because we may see in both of those metrics kind of a negative trend in the future. We won't be worried as long as they're able to sustain providing a good education and keeping within the budget. But if we're seeing that together with problems in their budget, that could be an early warning sign.
Right. Okay, so here we have another example of a school, right? So we have this school here, that enrollment trend looks great, right? They're kind of above this, I should have shifted to percentages, but they're kind of above this 0 line in almost every case, right? We have this 1 year that kind of comes down and there's like a slight trend downward, but overall seems to be doing fine, right? And so this is like one of the examples in which we said, actually percent of max is important. When you look at their percent of max, it's kind of all over the place, but it's definitely trending downward, right? And then when you pair that with the transfer rate, where they're losing between 19 and 10% of their students mid-year, every single year, and they're only at the peak keeping 82%, so they're losing 18% of their students at the end of the year, every single year or more, in most cases more. That this starts to paint a picture about a potential direction that the school is headed. That their enrollment trend looks okay, the percent of max may not look okay, depending on their finances, but this is definitely a problem. This could show us that they have no problems or they have some problem getting kids, obtaining or attracting students to come to the campus, but then they have a very difficult time keeping them, which could mean that there's culture problems at the school, that the way that they're doing discipline or the way that they're attempting to keep control or the way that they're interacting with parents or with the students or the curriculum or anything in that be problematic. Or that it was a cool idea and it's not implemented, or in any number of things, right? And so like having all of these data points together to kind of look at that, to start to understand what's going on with the school, it's far more impactful than just looking at one metric and saying, oh, they need to talk to them because they're in the norm. When you look at just the percent of max, right? This is where we've set them. We have 2 red lines because if a school's over 103%, they're automatically in the far below category because they're in breach of contract, right? They can't just keep enrolling students over their max. If they want more students, they need to amend their charter. And then we have this at below 70%, which we found that almost every single person was here. Our median category was here prior. Which means that, again, only outliers are in the not median and far below category. So we found that through statistical analysis that this is where the far below actually should be rather than the median. Actually, that's not true. We shifted the metric down for this one. I apologize. Metric for far below was at 75%. We've shifted it down to 70% because we found that without the added combination of this with the enrollment trend, this doesn't. And so the statistics said that 70% was more. Actually shifted this metric down.
On that above,
yeah.
The things that some charters, until they have enough data themselves to better educated guesses, make these random educated guesses to enroll 1,000 will enroll 1,300. And it's worked for 5 years and then it doesn't work and suddenly you are at 1.1 or you're at 1.06.
That's why we give them the 3% leeway. Because we know that things happen, right? You might get, you've got a family come in who all the siblings, the one sibling didn't, you don't want to split up the family, so you let them all in. So we don't cut it off right at 100%. We give that 3% leeway. That's what the board adopted. Whatever it was, you guys want to change that, but we just kind of take that. At 3%, we kind of looking at the data back then, it just seemed like it was pretty reasonable. And very, very rarely do we have a school that ever goes over that. And if
this is
they do,
10 years of data.
we just tell them, get back in it to it the next year. And they always do.
No, and it tends to be something they can manage over time once they have enough data.
Sure.
Unless there's an anomaly year like the COVID years.
Sure.
But the other part of that is I am aware just from doing some research, not relative to any school I've been involved in, but just because I'm interested, that even when that happens above 3%, WPU still follows the child, just not the other funding streams.
Sure.
So it's not tragic.
Just to be clear, all funding streams follow the student. So
okay, I was told back in the day that it was definitely the WPU. So, you know, it's a good practice, but it's not necessarily tragic if they're in that red zone. Obviously, very few are.
Sure.
But it's a metric that I will never stay up at night worrying about.
Or more read about this.
Yeah.
But it's good to know in case
is.
you say you're consistently pushing that upper end. Maybe you should consider amending your charter.
Of course.
And then we look at, you have the facilities, you have the capacity, and then to amend that charter or say, you know, until you get these things in place, you should probably stop pushing that upper end. But they may have a market that's just.
Action. Yeah.
Thing to notice for this data set is that the mean is at 83%, but the median is actually at 89%. So the median is at 89%. So most of our schools, like if you click in this way, most of our schools are kind of fall in actually that 89% range. But because of these massive outliers, it actually shifts that mean so hard. There was actually a couple of schools that had to remove far outlier data. They were skewing the mean by so much that the data set wasn't useful.
But it's those on that end that you want to be concerned.
Right. Yeah. So now moving into transfer rate. Transfer rate does have exceeding as does retention rate. The transfer rate, what we found was that 4%. If you are transferring less than 4% of your students out mid-year that you're exceeding, and no more than 3% higher from prior year. Meaning, if you were at 0% transfer and you went down to 4% transfer, you would no longer be eligible for exceeding. Meeting is at 7%, not meeting at 10, far below is below 10%. You see that the spread, very skewed data set in a good way, right? We want schools to have a smaller transfer rate. We don't want this to be in the center line. And so we see that most schools are kind of falling in this area, right? And the 7% encompasses all of the top bars here with the most frequency.
I just want to point out that having skewed data gives Andrew headaches.
Yeah.
But it's actually a good thing. I mean, this really is good that the vast majority of our schools, it's those, what you're saying, outliers. That's who we want to put our focus on.
We made the decision based on half a standard deviation, which would half standard deviation would be the exceeding, and half standard deviation would be the meeting. What we found with some of these with very skewed means versus medians that it wasn't actually the right choice because it was either too easy or too difficult to get into some of these. Looking at retention, we found that schools that retain 90% or more of their population should be in the exceeding category. That schools that are meeting 80% or more, which is again almost all of our data set, right? Should be in that meeting category. Not meeting is between 70 and the far below is below 70%. If you're losing 30% of your kids when you end the school year, between when you end and when you start again, there's something wrong. Something wrong. And so that may be explainable. It may have a perfectly reasonable explanation, but also may not. One other thing, that if you drop more than 10% in your retention, you're automatically qualified for far below. Because if you had a 98% retention rate and then you randomly dropped to a 70% retention rate, there's likely something wrong as well, and the data supports that.
When are those snapshots taken for the beginning of? This is each year, it's a fiscal year. You're looking at to a school year, right? School year. Where's the starting point? This is the snapshot we take of the starting, and this is a snapshot of the end.
Yeah, it's the very end of the school year.
We just take, every school has to report when their last day of school is. That's collected through you. That date is.
Okay.
And whenever the last, whoever's on that day.
So October 1, which gives you at least a consistent beginning date, which is a universal process state, that October 1 count. And then you are doing a variable end date. It's really tremendous to do.
Able to access the data. It's a lot of
schools that have very different calendar years, which makes all of these things headaches.
Right.
Winter sports, we kind of have to do almost by hand.
We have sports by hand. They do not fall on any of that. Even in state accountability, there's some things that like better to just blank because their dates are so different.
Yeah.
So brings us to our next step. Our next step is what happens? What do we do with this? That's something that we're still in conversation about. We don't want to rush that. It's complex, right? What happens if a school misses one metric? What happens if they miss two metrics? And which metrics are they missing? And why is that occurring? It just becomes so individualized that it's difficult to make a one-size-fits-all model, right? And if these things are easily explainable by the school or there's extenuating circumstances, it doesn't make sense to set a super hard cut thing because it's so individualized. And so we're having those conversations with the performance team, with the remediation team, with Jennifer. All of these kind of conversations are occurring. And I wouldn't say heated, but like they are very intense, right? Heated is not the word I would use. Intense, right?
Intense is the right word.
Intense meaning like, we're really digging in, right? Passionate discussion. Yeah, we're really digging in and saying like, well, does this really make sense? Well, what if this? What if this? And trying to make sure that we're looking at for things from every angle, from every outlier, to make sure that our model is.
And to just say, what if is if?
Could be, yeah, very well.
Well,
it seems like a reasonable response.
One problem that we've had with how it's been far is that we do want our, if that's giving us a really look at schools. And we're trying to. Unnecessary. So we're trying to really, we really want to hone in and be able to adapt. Also, our future goal is when we get this set is we want to be able to.
Absolutely.
So that schools can know, parents can know, community can know, but we want to make sure we're publishing good data, that we are not making it that a school, just because they miss one metric, I mean, you just went through the outliers. There may be really good reasons why there were some schools that missed some of those outliers, but really good reasons why they did. I mean, and so we're just wrestling with that so that we can give the most appropriate. Never going to be perfect. That's why we have the R&R. But that's also why we don't want to just look into everyone, because we might as well just do R&R for every school every year. And that's just not manageable with the number of staff that we have. Right.
And it overburdens schools unnecessarily.
Good thing about this is we really are minimizing the burden on schools. And when we talk about academics, I'll talk about
Other things just in your head, and I know it's, but this process and what you've discovered, something you should share like at NACSA. Learn from them.
So, you know, we did submit a couple of, we were trying. Remember the one for all the charts. We didn't. But we are going to try to NACSA. That's probably where they want to hear more.
Was it
authorized.
this about this?
No, there were other things that we have. This is brand new.
One last question that we're considering is what if one school under an LEA is meeting and other schools not? But like their percent max is the entire LEA, not individualized schools. So like it just kind of becomes problematic if like have a bunch of different schools and they're padding their percent of max with one school and one of the schools is lagging behind with, you know, it seems like a 30%, right? Like how does that work? What does that mean? And but like what power do we have in that? Right. Should that be anything if right, exactly. So those are the kind of questions that we're looking at. We're going to move into academics. This is a short kind of section.
Before we do that, are there any questions or thoughts about the enrollment? I love what you guys have shared. It's really good to hear. It's so clever. What I have heard, I just want to kind of say back, it sounds like you are supportive of the direction you're
Yes. 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 Yeah.
I think it's a good compromise. Ability. I'm going to add, by the way, compassionate statistics.
Right? You did.
I'm pulling that in.
It's so funny. We were
My
talking
new
like,
space.
like how do we say like how do we word this? And I said like compassionate statistics. Jennifer goes, "We're joking, but that sound good." And she was like, "You're just saying that because I like statistics." And I was like, "I don't know. I kind of like it too. I like statistics."
That and one year trend is not a trend. Both of those are good.
So in my job before I came here, we would say N of 1, and that just was kind of a cue into us that you cannot base your information or what you're saying on an N of 1.
Right.
People do.
I say your anecdotal evidence does not generalize to society.
Yeah,
there's that one. Use bigger words than I should. So we're not going to go over the financial metrics. The financial metrics were basically focusing on the ones that we have. What we are going to be looking at is combining the things that we were only going to look at the 5-year review, and we're only going to look at the annual and combine that and look at that. I think you saw from Lisa that we are looking at those carefully and thoughtfully, and I don't see a lot of needed changes, though I know Anne on that. So we're just going to academics and then.
Last thing that I want to say about the enrollment, about the academics, about all the finance stuff, is it something that's been like the mantra through this entire process from Jennifer, from me, from William. 6 isn't the end all be all. talking about this, we're saying like, oh, well, the statistics say this. And the mantra through the entire thing is, what about humans? Like, what about the schools? And so that's something that's been at the forefront.
At one time, instead of saying compassionate statistics, we had, that did not look right.
We actually wrote that on the slide, and then it looked so bad written down, the two ends in a row, that we just said, let's find something else. to write.
So in the academic metrics, CSPS, it used, ability, and that's what it largely used. When we worked with the work group, went more towards want to value the goals that are in the charter agreement. It's really hard because goals set, some of them really, really bad. Some are just, they're never going to meet those goals. There's some that were created back in the, everyone was going to get 100% from
The Stone Age.
The Stone Age.
You will see some of those goals. You will see some that have like 30 goals that they have set. And anyway, so the work group decided, well, we'll gather certifications every year from the schools on whether or not they're reviewing their goals and are they working towards them. And that just created more burden on it. It was a checkbox. And we found that we were just trying to get people to answer more than we were even looking at the information. And it also, as Andrew has pointed out, our main goal is early warning, not giving us an early warning. So we also are looking at the goals. I already talked about them. They're using some that mention old CRTs, which means very different now. And or they put in things that they were going to different tests, but then they have to keep paying for those tests, and they might want to use something different or not have to keep paying for it. There's just so many problems on that.
Can I just add one thing? Just another point to that. So some of the charter agreements from 2011 have 27 goals. And so that's just some schools have one or two, and then there's others that have 27. And so they're being held to.
There's some goals where they are saying, we're going to have 95% participation of parents at parent night. And so there's things in there that are just ridiculous. We find that when schools care about their goals the most is when they want an expansion or a satellite. And then it becomes very difficult because no matter where the school is in actual performance, they want to set goals that they can get the satellite or expansion. Now that can be really easy discussion with us, and we've had some of those where, they're performing really well. We agree with that they're good with the goals that we suggest. We're good to go. But there's a lot of back and forth where we just get stuck with schools, and it gets tough. We'll just put it that way. It really causes some frustration on both sides. And I've been talking with other authorizers. How do they navigate it? And I haven't gotten good answers.
So much frustration, the fact that some schools just hide for a decade, hoping that we don't look at their charter agreement.
Right. So they need an expansion or satellite.
Or we go do their comprehensive.
Have 29 goals. We can't measure 29 of them because they just aren't measurable.
I was gonna say they're not even SMART goals, so you can't even measure them.
Right.
Yeah.
Like how do you measure we'll create patriotism in our students, right? It's like now we have to measure that. Make sure you're doing it. How is this possible?
Now I do want you to know we've been looking at data, but we don't have the data and the robustness of the data like we did. As you may know, there's been some changes over the years in the accountability systems of us, et cetera, et cetera. We also want to make sure that things are individual for schools because they're so. We also are waiting. We know at an accountability redesign, we also want to see what that looks like, because there's a lot of sense to using the state accountability, because that's what the real estate, talk about your schools, that's what they, and it's what a lot of people look at. But we also want to be very mindful of that our schools serve different the one that's my favorite of these three is the relative performance, where we would use state ability to be able to on your slide. Okay, good. But where it's comparing against like schools. So
Demographically.
They're looking at who's similar, so that a school that's maybe serving an underserved population doesn't get deemed because they're not college schools.
Where the state accountability is doing percentiles based on the entire state's data set.
Yeah.
This is looking at schools that are like.
Now, the MUSAs, as we commonly refer to, that's really goals, and it stands for the minimum standards of achievement.
Student achievement.
Yes, there you go. There gets confusion when you call goals, because some people think goals, that's aspirational. That's not what these are. Have this issue with using goals because it requires schools to end. It also requires them to submit more. So one possible thing that we've been kind of playing around with is the idea is that maybe to kind of do a first cut. And those that maybe have concerns, that's something that's still in process. And I'm thinking I'm probably stepping on your, but this is something that we are thinking a lot about of how to do to minimize what's required on schools, but to be fair and to value.
So there's some pros and cons to using the school grade or the percentile calculation, right? So state accountability currently uses this structure, right? And what I did was I pulled all the state's data, and then because the state doesn't like separate that into the percentiles, I pulled it all in and created percentiles for growth, percentiles for proficiency, and percentiles for the total score that each school is given based on all of the different factors. For high school, it includes graduation rates, it includes going on to college, things like that. So the pros of that is that it's easy to understand. Like I can understand that the 50th percentile is where it's the average, and that I know how the 90th percentile is extremely high, right? They're quick buckets to kind of throw schools into. It's why it's so widely used. It's statistically appropriate. It decreases reporting burdens on schools because I can just pull their data by myself. I just do it all by myself. It's standardized. It increases parental trust in schools' quality. If I know that out of every single school in the state, the school's ranked in the 95th percentile, I know that I can trust that is accurate, and I can trust that schools are going to do well, depending on what I want for my child, right? If it's academics, if it's growth, if it's whatever it is that they're looking at. And it's consistent with USB's current measures. So we would have to design anything on our own, but throw that time and energy and money into designing our own structure, which would potentially do the same thing that they're already doing. And the cons is something that Jennifer already kind of talked about, right? Is that this is not mission and vision specific. We have a school that's focused on a very specific population. That this is potentially not beneficial for them in any way. It actually potentially hurts them in terms of us looking at their academic performance, because their growth numbers may be astronomical, but their students when they're coming in are low enough that the proficiency levels are going to be extremely low, but their growth numbers may be high. And so this kind of allows to look at all of those different kinds together to paint a fuller and more appropriate and more equitable picture when we're looking at schools' performance.
Well, and just along with this, at least historically, I don't know where state turnaround moment, but historically, this is what state turnaround has looked at, that they take if you've been in the bottom 3% for 2 years in a row, okay, you're now in state turnaround. Well, if you look at who gets in state turnaround, there are certain types of schools serving certain types of students that are always in there. And then the question is, well, what are we measuring? Are we really measuring schools? And so
Or demographics.
Yeah.
So when we started asking the questions like, well, what is performance? One of the questions became like, if you're in art school, is your performance of your art not right? And so we have had these conversations, which leads to like a more broad or more all-encompassing understanding of what a school, how a school is doing, not just according to the percentile that they're pushed into based on the state stakes. One of the other cons is this reliant on available data. We can't use qualitative data that we don't have access to that would require us to survey more schools or school students or faculty or anything like that. And one other problem we already talked about is demographics. So one of the struggles that we're having right now is that on Data Gateway, this is an example of a school that's not ours. This is how it kind of looks, right, for the performance measures. This would be the school, and then all of the gray ones are the ones that they're beating, and all of the orange ones are the ones that are beating them. This would be ELA, math, and science. One of the struggles that we have currently is that on Data Gateway, which is where this is housed, there's no ability to download either this as an Excel file or the entire data set as an Excel file. And so what we have to do is download this as a PDF and hand copy all of it over every single school, which we're doing currently for comp reviews, which is okay because we're not doing the entire portfolio every single year, but it's very inefficient and it's error prone. So I've been in contact with Data and Statistics, and we have a plan to resolve that issue. So I'm in that conversation of what that plan looks like and how that plan is going to unfold. But that's what we're working on currently, which is why we don't have all of the data sets like we did for the enrollment metrics, why we don't have all the statistics and stuff currently ready. It's because I don't want to do that. I don't want to hand calculate it all. I will if I have to. I will if I have to, but I don't.
Well, and if I can also add to it, something that Data is also working on is right now, if you go to the compare schools, you can click on proficiency and you can get proficiency for ELA, math, science, and then you can get that for growth. So you've got 6 different scores. But what if they're all over the place? How do you account for that? And so they're working on doing this for the state accountability so that it's already put together. So you don't have to figure out, well, if they're good in 3 and they're not good in 3, how do I? It's already, someone else has already figured out how to file this.
And in their total score, when we're talking about percentiles, in their total score, all of that is already accounted for. Their growth, like all of those percentiles are already accounted for in their data shifting. So here are proposed academic metrics. And again, these are, I should remove the word proposed because these are the academic metrics that we're kind of thinking about, right? And because we don't have all the data yet to really analyze, we don't actually know if these are appropriate, especially this year, right? This is just like, I like round numbers, and so we kind of put them in because we don't actually know if these are appropriate yet. This may become 8. We don't actually know how this all works, right? Because we haven't had a chance to analyze the full data set. Now the state accountability, this is where their metrics are set for the most part. And so we haven't decided if we're going to keep the same exact metrics they have set for their grades, or if we're going to continue to do grades when they move away from grades. We don't know all of those specifics yet, but this is kind of what we're looking at for now.
So it's one, or you're contemplating all 3?
So all 3 of these will be our academic metrics.
Well,
right?
no, we're looking at all 3. We don't know yet. It might be a combination of all 3. We might do, kind of where I was talking about the 2-part system where we use, say, maybe the things that we can do without bugging schools. And then if we need to look forward, then we go to the next metric. We still have to figure all that out, but there's some technical things we have to do first before we can analyze the data. And when we're looking at this, we may decide that one of these measures or we may find, hey, there's another way of looking at it, just like we did with the enrollment trend, where we kind of were thinking, we knew that there was problems, but we weren't sure where we were going to up. And so we're going to have to see it's built on compassionate statistics, right? Common sense along with what the data kind of.
And what's manageable for you.
That's less.
There's some,
Yeah.
but you could do a lot of things, but it's just not gonna be manageable.
Yeah.
And you get appropriate information, something that isn't as rigorous maybe, but we get appropriate information and it's manageable. You can.
That's something Jennifer and I were talking about on the way down, was that we would rather not try to analyze the school's misses every single year, because that would require us to go out and get that data from the school every
Yeah,
single
no.
year to put in the annual report. Seems problematic and frustrating for all parties. And so that maybe this is contingent upon one of these or both of these not doing so well, right? So then we look at something like that, right? Or they're looked at every comp review or.
And it's a logical extension potentially once you land on it. Different goals. Here's something we could use, and some of those are things you might. But what our accountability role.
That's where the comp reviews are so helpful because it starts those discussions. The discussion when it isn't like high stakes qualify for a satellite or expansion, those discussions actually are a lot easier. And one of the things, so in the past, it says for like enrollment and financial metrics that it is what, we set for the CSAC. And we've actually been starting to, we've got at least one, maybe. We've got a couple of schools who have agreed to this where we just do the same. That way we don't have every time the accountability system changes. And so we're trying to make it so that it is fair, it is flexible, but also doable.
They have their 26 goals, but what we're looking at for their academics is their minimum standard.
We're going to try to talk them out of
Sure, but if they need 26, we can look at what we need to look at.
Sometimes it's Marie negotiate between the school and the committee, and school says this works for us, and we say not enough, and she has to go back and try. It'd just be easier not to have to be that middle person going back and forth if there was kind of a consistent place. That's where it lands.
That would be
Because that
great.
is we put Maria in a bad position too, I think. I mean, she's always smiles and is pleasant, but that's a more difficult position. But just my thought too in all of it is I like the notion, if you can come to the place of comparing like schools, because I think that then you're this school's mission for themselves and kind of what's a like school compared. And I also, just for myself, I'm not, we're always worried about where kids end, but that growth is, to me, more important. Was this because some kids are going to come to our schools not having enjoyed the school where they were before and just struggling through it, and come to one of our schools and be highly successful. That growth, even though they may not end up, that student has made a huge growth. They may not end up where some other students are yet, but they've made such growth in that time. That growth seems to be really.
Unless you're looking at a school that has a lot of high performing students to begin with. Growth gets wonky when you don't have a lot of room for it, right?
I get that. I get that.
Beautiful way. That is that that doesn't happen. We don't seem to see that. In fact, some of our top schools, they're the ones with the highest growth, which is really amazing. But that was an initial concern.
But that
And
it is still
depending upon how growth is calculated, that could be a very big.
Yeah, that's a good.
Because if it's tested and it keeps tapping you at grade level, then you are going to see that.
Yeah.
It depends on the kind of test, an interim test you're taking for those.
And that's where the
is in the 99th percentile for academics for both growth and and percentile.
See, I think that was one of the good things of No Child Left Behind is that we started to disaggregate it. I think it is. But it only looked at minimum performance. How many can we get over the minimum bar? Not how many we can in some schools, how high can we reach kids?
And to your point, because we've also talked a lot about growth, and some of this, we may have to do something for.
Right.
Because
I
right
know you're
now,
restricted.
they've put in a lot of great work. Is what's called status or like the proficiency, maybe more than what we would want to account for. So we've got to see what it's going to look like. That's if we need us, or hopefully just the ideal is that they that focuses.
I know. So I'm saying lots of prejudices, but I know you can only do what you can manage. And USBE is doing, as an SEA, that's what they have to report. Our kids achieving some bar. And so that's what they're reporting. And so that's where their metrics are, as opposed to some of the other things you're doing. I understand that, but you also have to do what's manageable.
Will you be looking at year-over-year trends?
We can look at a whatever degree, because testing wasn't. Right, it becomes hairy.
This one's much
But
harder.
over time, I should say.
Yeah, I have to say, having COVID in with the enrollment metrics, actually, it answered some questions because we were worried, like, that was gonna throw it off. Andrew tested that, it didn't, and so it
Actually was better for most of our schools.
it was able to help us to see that even if you have a worldwide pandemic, what happens and it's stronger. For
Schools are actually declining
academics,
now.
but that was thrown into and that was counted.
They took it at home with parents sitting next to them.
But
No, I'm talking about enrollment.
Oh, enrollment, I was thinking the tests.
The tests are actually fairly similar.
they are, but you do have a year where you don't have, you've got some problems with growth in there. And you have that the accountability system has changed a few times, the
And
test has.
changes of the tests, yes.
So we'll do.
What you can.
10 years that you did. Now, in 20.
Schools are testing.
Yeah, but I'm looking at.
Any other questions, comments? I was like, how long do you think? I was like, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes. Here we are an hour and a half later.
People that really like data talking.
That's right, I didn't pay attention.
We like data too.
We were very interested.
It was
It's-
funny.
I like
You're
this
talking
format.
data.
Do the rest of you kind of like this, when we do learning things that we can just talk and it's more free? I do, so thank you for doing that and for your excellent preparation too, and it's just.
Funny when Jennifer, when we first started talking, she's like, well, like trying to make it not as data heavy. Like as I was looking at it, I was like, I don't know how, like I literally just don't know how to talk through this without showing.
You did
It's a
take out
presentation.
I took out a lot of it actually.
I didn't hear one person snort. Good, so that's
Maybe in the
good.
back.
We
No,
didn't
they-
smart.
No, they
Not
were
saying
Very
they were alert.
They were supportive, so that. Thank you so much.
Bro
I
snorts,
would
sir.
recommend that we take a little break again, just run to the restroom and let's see where.
We live every minute.
Addition, remember that as a board, we set those governance level goals for outcomes, but we let staff determine how to achieve them. We were quite prescriptive in how we wanted the staff to achieve them in this plan. And that may be a place where we want to take a step back. So we may want to take a step forward on specificity and the metrics and the outcomes on prioritization. And then take a step back on some of the how, so that our staff can determine with their expertise how to achieve those. And I just want to remind you of the categories quickly. Building a strong organization, especially as you're thinking of priorities, we should probably in our next, planning meeting for this or workshop on the strategic plan, actually visually prioritize what we want. Building a strong organization, and many of the little things in each of these are fantastic. Didn't do a horrible job in some things, but we definitely needs work. Authorizing quality charter schools. That, I believe, is one of our most ableist categories, even though it's a really great idea and we don't give a lot of metrics, except maybe no metrics in that. Increasing innovation and choice is a little bit amorphous in terms of SMART goals. Chart of performance, our staff is doing a really great job of inferring how we might measure that, but we haven't set a SMART outcome that we want that's board level. Providing meaningful and transparent oversight. Again, we have some very specific things that we sort of task staff to do. What's the board goal? And what is the metric by which we're going to measure that? Not there. Supporting school operators. We've done a lot of good over the last year doing that. Many of us as board members have even been involved in some of those trainings. But again, it's a broad category without a SMART goal. There might be some little teeny SMART goals within year 1, year 2, year 3, year 5, and so on. And then improving the relationship between the SCSB and USB. That's going to be a good segue into Chair Bull's discussion about the MOU. But I frankly love our categories. I think we did a super good job there. What if I were a staff member, I'd be asking, what is the overall outcome you want achieved here? And what is the priorities for our work, if I'm a staff member? And one of the things that's come up frequently, I just throw this out there, we're not going to solve anything today, is that staff has often, just either individual staff members, Jennifer, some of our strategic planning meetings, in informal conversation, it has come up many times that it's hard for the board and it's hard for staff both, which means it's the board's fault though. To know whether or how they ought to prioritize supporting charter schools against monitoring and perhaps even more punitive action. I don't know if, that's been hard for any iteration of the board, but why don't we be the ones to kind of with language and outcomes that make it easier for our staff to do their work. So as you think about, I've reminded you of the big categories again. You can go look at the document Jennifer sent out, the PDF. But as we come back to, whenever we do come back to this, come back with some SMART goals, some suggestions. This is your assignment. Some suggestions for pricing of the goals, some SMART goals, and then so the third SMART goals, and the third thing is what can we do with the outcome governance level goals that we set and priorities that we set? They'll demonstrate to our staff how we want to resolve the role of the board, which means really the staff, in terms of supporting schools and in terms of sort of monitoring and for harsher measures against schools, with our warning, our probation, and with some other kinds of actions. We should get. Well, it'll be easy to do because 0 times 1 is still 0. So yes. Okay, that's your assignment, and we will have productive times ahead.
So on the agenda, it actually said that Vice Chair Phillips is going to lead the MOU. I'm there. I'm gonna.
I knew that you were going to.
I'll start through. I actually. Oh, okay. Cindy's good.
I can if you need me to.
Well, you chime in because this is a workshop. We're really going to brainstorm. What we would like to do. You may know that we've been trying to, for some time, actually, more than a long time. Yeah, it's been years.
7 years.
Trying to come to agreement with this state board. Actually, mostly we've met with state board leadership, and we have opportunity now with the new state board leadership again back to address that. How we conduct business back and forth, and how we work together. Even as auditors report not long ago was saying that's something that we needed to have in place as well to have that MOU that we could always who does what and who has responsibility for what and at what what are the protocols for doing that. So maybe right now, what I'd like to talk about then is to talk about what should be the elements of that MOU. What are we interested in having just from our perspective at this point, and then we'll start to do that work toward that end. I think it's good timing to do it, to get that done, that with a new board leadership, that, I mean, to haven't met yet with them, but we will.
A little
Recently,
background,
but yeah.
A little background that will be helpful.
Yes.
Then you'll be realistic what you ask for, though you can still do blue sky. You should know that we're kind of under a legislative sledgehammer on this. It's not, I don't think that's an exaggeration. Senator Fillmore has wanted this resolved and has given us essentially this year before the next legislative session, resolve it administratively, or else language will be included in some kind of a bill or a proposed bill. And it probably won't be what either we or the USPE want, and it may unfavorably make us in an independent way that would it's prohibitive, would scare staff, is what Jennifer said over here, if you couldn't hear her say. So that's one thing. The second thing is that Brian and I spent a lot of time in meetings prior to the legislative session, because we were actually trying to work it out before then, because we were sort of on a sledgehammer, you know, under the sword of Damocles, kind of working hard to get it done before then. And we were able to persuade the legislature to give us this one more year to try to do it. But we were actually trying to figure it out before this last session. And one of the things we learned in that conversation, I hadn't known, I don't think Brian had known before either. And maybe wasn't known even by some of our other leadership who were that gained a greater understanding that we're not frustrated about it a little bit still, but a greater understanding of the way we are set up from a both state legislative and in some ways federal legislative. We're set up in a relationship with our SEA that does limit in ways that we trying to work around what things we can and can't do. So if we are going to have an administrative rather than a legislative solution, we will have to work within the bounds currently established. And that is that no matter how much we would like a certain kind of autonomy within these bounds, it will always be the way it's set up now, without statutory change. It will always be that the USB has to account from they have to be the accountable member for all the money that we receive. Think about that. You know, I always chafe against it when I was a director, against being accountable for how many people took the RISE test when I can't enforce it. Right? That just made me so mad, no matter what I did. Or have no teeth as schools to force or compel beyond a very, very limited deal our students to attend. But we're accountable. So what you find sometimes, the pushback of the USPE and particularly financial department, is you want to have control, but I'm the one who's accountable. And so we understand that in other contexts and what an unfortunate position you're in if you're trying to work with another institution that feels autonomous because they're a governor appointed board, they're allocated money by the legislature, and somebody else actually accounts for that money, not them. So as you're thinking about an MOU, know that we've come to a different place in understanding the limits of our autonomy, but we still want as much as possible in that framework if we're going to have an administrative solution. And of course, the other thing always looming here is we can seek a statutory change that gives us all kinds of autonomy, which we may not want. It's one of those be careful what you wish for moments. Yeah. Because when you become a procuring entity, you are then responsible for the same kinds of things as an LEA or any other procuring entity of the state would be responsible for. That's not, may be great, and it may not be great.
Is it functionally that different?
But we are not a procuring entity.
But we have to live as if we were, because we are.
Use them, or I think that's a benefit.
And that's part of the question. Are we a subset or are we standalone from the State Board of Education? But there are pieces that we rely on them relative to if they've allocated dollars to a school and that school fails, are we as responsible to repay that money? Or they're the ones who issue the money, they're responsible for repaying them. I think that's part of discussion. We have kind of a draft of an MOU. But we haven't really to the whole board said, what are the in that and what kind of relationship do we establish? So this is.
It might be good too to tell what problems we've run into so that you know why we're seeking more autonomy. And this is one that Brian just referenced. The others have been, we have this pot of money. We just saw it, Jennifer did a financial report. And if we have enough money to hire another staff member, our staff, even if our board approves that money be spent on another staff member, we sometimes find ourselves in the position of being told no, of our board's decision being told no, by our staff members being told no, by staff members of the State Board of Education, when their board has not even considered it. So staff members of another board sometimes tell our staff members operating under our directive, no, we don't like that.
Yeah. So is this our budget to use as the money's been allocated to the state charter school board? Is this our money then to use? Or can someone say, we have a little shortfall, we're gonna take some of your money to use for our shortfall?
They can and do. Can I give another example that isn't maybe positive or negative on the other side, but you have in the state government, under the governor, they get sometimes certain directives, like around the holidays, they get often in addition, always have aligned with USBE, which governor, because we're in the same offices. And so we align with USBE because follow their procedures, the dates, like if they're having a building party or something, an employee action thing, we join in with that. We participate in that. And so that's neither, I guess it's positive, I guess you could say, but that is another thing that maybe probably should be spelled out in an MOU. How do we interact?
So, we could go to one extreme of we're going to out of this building completely, run our own facilities, do our own thing, or we like some parts of the relationship. It's nice to have that connection as well. Do we? Oh, you should know.
Access to data.
That's right, access to data. We do pay, but we do pay for
direct costs.
Indirect costs. Like there's some things that, and being in a place, we do have, there are some costs to being here, but it is not at the level probably if we had our own buildings.
And in fact, in statute was changed as Senator Fillmore didn't like the idea that the USPE was considering us just another department, which frankly is exactly how we're set up financially. So it's kind of fake to not like it. Not that he's fake in his dislike, and that we haven't also disliked that. But we actually had the language stricken from the statute that said that we were to be charged the same amount for rent in this building as other departments of the USBE, and instead allowed us to continue to be charged only that, but had the language, I'm not going to remember the exact language, but something like, let the state charter school board rent area at the same cost as the USBE would charge their own departments, kind of a thing, because he didn't like the language that suggested we were simply a department of the USB. But that's great, and I like that clarification. But in fact, the way that we are financed is exactly as if we were another department of the USBE. Hence the need for the MOU to spell out things that we want to be independent regarding, and that we want them to agree. And in fact, Angie Stallings was the one who suggested that the best way to do it, even though of course it can be changed, but might be through board rule, because it's harder to change board rule once it's there. You have to actually have good reasons. And it typically isn't something that a board just goes rogue on just to be sort of retaliatory or something, especially if it's been negotiated well. So that's another way that she thought that if we bring that to the Board of Ed, and as a group they approved language, part of board rule, MOU to sort of our relationship spelled out. Idea.
There have been other entities that separated rehabilitation. And they've been separated completely, and they've moved away. This building used to house association, Principals Youth Association, the elementary school principal, asked to find new places because USB was expanding out, and they have their own organizations. What was happening with the land trust folks? They were down here.
No, they're still there.
They're still there. So that's kind of, they're still not under the state board, but they have a relationship with the state board. Share your thinking, share your thoughts, and we'll work on it and let you.
I'm concerned that we never find ourselves in an AISU position. I think that's huge on all of our minds, right? I think we can, I'm willing to look at creative solutions if what we can think of, right? Does that mean we are financially going to be held to account? Maybe we move some portions of our accountability back to the US. Yeah, maybe that actually works, right? Or, you know, maybe we can establish with them, hey, these are the rules. Work that out.
Yeah. So one thing we did after that.
Legislative.
Yes. So we worked really hard after what happened to monies that we had and that were allocated for specific purposes by the legislature to us to do X with, that were used to settle, as we know. We hard for a solution there. And so was Representative Snow, Charter World, and it wasn't a perfect solution. And now we have each charter student, the tiny amount the legislature put up, so many million to begin with. And when the fund reaches 10 million or something, I'm just throwing these out, but it's something close to this. When it reaches 10 million, stable and charter school students don't pay into it. And it's a very modest, like $2 a student. And that will forever be used for restricted funds owing to the state or federal government. Charter school closes after all of its own assets have been used to pay its restricted funds. And it may not be used to pay any other debt, but just restricted funds, because that's the 401c3's own problem. And in fact, the USBE, both Scott Jones and Angie Stallings were involved in the finer points of detail of that legislation. So it was very collaborative. And so actually no authorizer state should ever again find themselves in the position that we did, AISU. We did a broad-based solution for that. So, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other ASU-like things that could happen to us.
That's exactly what I'm saying, right? I remember what happened. But the underlying problem remains, and I would like to see us, as we establish an MOU, to carefully and creatively as we can about how to work responsible financially. I think
Well, and in some ways, this legislative solution was a nod by the legislature to the fact that they had not conceived of the actual risk of authorizing innovative schools in the state, and somehow inexplicably calculated that the risk to like restricted funds would be zero. And so they actually put a significant amount in to kind of as a goodwill gesture to the fact that they had probably should have done something like that before, and then wanted the charter world to sustain it, which is also reasonable. And hopefully it'll never be drawn on but we know that. I mean, it would only have been drawn on once in 25 years had it existed, right? Because the other schools that have closed have ultimately been able to resolve any restricted funds owing, if any were. So, that's a pretty good track record, and I think that says good authorizing and good monitoring. But you're right. I mean, if in fact we're essentially from a state auditor, financial auditing position, a department of the USBE, which we are from that perspective, technically speaking, they can take that money anytime for any reason without an MOU. And the extreme opposite of this is to be even been suggested that we housed in the governor's area, because we are a governor appointed board, and be completely independent and a procuring entity, something like, some public works are designated, that they're kind of just out there. They're nothing like them, and they're just there. It's a big rigmarole because we started that process.
Then we missed the relationship relative to like our procurement, other kinds of things, having a relationship.
Helpful, yes. And cheap. Say the word cheap.
Our rent is zero. Our maintenance, but authorizer.
This would be for us more specifically.
Yes.
And so.
A rule to govern one entity is like a misappropriation of.
And an MOU is.
No, it wouldn't.
No, this
But
was
if
just
you-
Angie's. This was
If Angie's
Angie's
saying
suggestion.
rule, then the rule needs to be authorizer's relation.
Well, the legislature has already set a precedent to treat us differently in statute.
But our origin is different because we did start as a department. of the council, right? I mean, our origin is as a single employee of USB. So,
our
when John
origin-
Roberg was here, and then Marlies, and then the State Charter School Board was created. So we have a different origin story than other authorizers. Caused a lot of this headache. So, and we still have our tasks with tasks that other authorizers don't have, like startup funds and managing grants and
training everybody.
Things, right? So, but that's where I still think a rule becomes problematic for just one.
Well, think of what they did this last election, though. They made a rule that only we as an authorizer and not other authorizers have to have certain rules governing our committees and our policies. So they have, and part of that is our education authorizes one, maybe two, or none, right? So maybe that category is so distinct from other authorizers that it would justify a rule.
Well, I think the elected board versus appointed policies are already scrutinized as an elected board in a way that ours weren't. Right.
But other authorizers don't have to follow the rules. We do.
Authorizing, but I mean,
that's another story.
But what I'm saying, they've already distinguished us by certain requirements and by certain responsibilities. So I don't think it would be entirely inconsistent to make board rule about our MOU. The thing about an MOU otherwise, one of the reasons I liked it, because I can see your point, is that Now, board rule gets amended, but it only sunsets when it's replaced by something better typically. Or it's become obsolete because the federal funds have run out. Or, board rule has lasting power. It would be maybe a better legacy than just a contract or an agreement. Some board chair signs, not that you're not just some board chair, you know what I'm saying though? Because if it's like a 3-year agreement or 5-year agreement as opposed to board rule, I know it can be revoked. I know it can be sunsetted, but it seemed to be have a little more lasting power to me. That's why I thought maybe that's a good idea. Oh,
At this point, we've kind of approached from the MO. But it could. Thoughts to that? Let us get started and we'll work. There's a draft. We just need to go back and look through it.
I think it's going to be significantly revised because it was written prior to the AISU situation with the USBE.
We'll get AAG. Well, Olson, so what I said, I'm still back on David, sorry. We'll get him involved and help.
Important to know too that the people who were in this meeting with us did not like the idea that our staff, our director would have to go for, something we had money for and that our board had given permission for. They didn't like that. They didn't like that their staff was somehow in a position to tell our staff no under those circumstances.
And I say that their staff generally doesn't say no, but there have been some instances they have, or we've had to fight for certain things. Generally speaking, their staff, not generally, their staff is just great to work with. I don't want to give a different impression from that.
That has usually been good.
Yes.
We disagree. Why did you keep sending special ed dollars? Why did you say when our charter board said, don't send that to them, and you still did? Why did that happen? And now you're asking for them to pay it back. So why can't we be proactive? And so there are some little times like that we say, and does that money, once it's been allocated, our school board, does it belong, plan for it and use it for someone say, oh, I see you've got some, we have a need, and so we're gonna. So some of those things have to be worked out. Yeah. Okay, thank you all. Thanks for that discussion. We're at a place where that we do need to, a little bit behind our schedule, but I don't think it will take a long time, but we do have a need to go into discussion for 2 purposes. One, to discuss pending education, and another one for a competency of tool. And I'll explain all those to you once we are there. I can have a motion to go close them on and all that kind of stuff.
Motion. Closed session for the purpose of discussing civil pending.
Sure. Of an individual. And so I'm here, so Member Smith has made that motion and I'm seeing Bassett seconding that. All those in favor say aye.
Do roll call, don't you?
Oh, yeah, we have to do roll call. Member Bassett.
Aye.
Member.
Aye.
Member Smith.
Aye.
And AAG Chung.
Olson.
I said, yeah, notice I caught myself. I'm getting closer. Olson, it will stay in with us. Just make sure we stay on task and
Recorded, correct?